For 400 years, heaven seemed silent. No prophet, no vision, no voice to pierce the darkness. Yet in the stillness, history was quietly preparing for a cry in Bethlehem that would change the world forever. The voice of Malachi faded into the air like the last note of a song that refuses to resolve. His warnings had been sharp, his hope still rooted in covenant promises, yet when he fell silent, no other rose to take his place. For centuries, the children of Israel had known the rhythm of prophetic speech, the sudden interruption of divine voice through chosen men and women. Now, the heavens closed. No thunder, no visions, no new scrolls to add to the sacred collection. The people repeated his words in the synagogues, clung to his rebukes and consolations, and waited for the next voice that never came. What does a nation do when the stream of revelation runs dry? They turned to memory. The priests carried on their duties in the temple, lighting lamps, offering sacrifices, reciting prayers that stretched back to Sinai. Yet without a living prophet, the rituals began to feel heavier, as though each smoke column reached upward into silence. The scribes multiplied, recording every nuance of the Torah, debating its meaning line by line, convinced that if the divine voice no longer spoke freshly, then truth must be guarded in what was already given. In their care, the law became not only scripture but fortress, a hedge against forgetfulness, a lifeline until God spoke again. Among the people, longing deepened. The promises of a messenger who would prepare the way still echoed in Malachi's closing lines. A day would come when the Sun of Righteousness rose with healing in its wings. But when? Each generation hoped the next might see it. Each funeral reminded them that waiting could stretch longer than a lifetime. Silence became its own teacher, pressing faith into forms that ritual and study alone could not sustain. To believe without new signs demanded endurance, a trust in memory rather than vision. The world beyond Jerusalem marched on. Persian officials collected tribute, governors oversaw the small Judean province, and life for most was a cycle of planting and harvest, festivals and mourning, births and burials. Yet, under the surface, the absence of prophecy shaped their imagination. If God would not speak now, then surely he was preparing something immense. The hush felt pregnant, like air heavy before a storm. Every injustice seemed to demand an answer. Every unanswered prayer sharpened expectation. Malachi had spoken of refining fire, of a messenger who would come suddenly to the temple, and of a covenant God who did not forget. The people repeated these words at night by oil lamps, teaching them to children who asked why God no longer spoke. The answer was always the same. He had spoken, and he would speak again. Between those certainties stretched a silence that tested hearts more than exile or war ever had. For silence is not emptiness. It is the pause before the next word. And for Israel, that word was still on its way. The days after Malachi felt like standing on a shoreline after the tide has gone out. The water had always returned, wave after wave of prophets carrying God's word, sometimes fierce, sometimes tender, but always unmistakable. Now the sand lay bare and dry. The people looked to the horizon and found only silence. No Elijah thundering against kings, no Isaiah singing of hope, no Jeremiah weeping over ruins. The voice of God, once so near, seemed to have stepped back into eternity. Israel still prayed, still offered sacrifices, still read the scrolls, yet each ritual bore the ache of waiting. The question pressed against every heart. Had God withdrawn his voice forever? Expectation filled the void. Fathers and mothers told their children that the silence itself was a sign, that heaven was holding its breath. The prophecies of old became more than history. They turned into anchors for hope. Words about a coming king, a messenger preparing the way, a light dawning in darkness, were repeated with fresh urgency. When no new word was given, the old words glowed brighter. They were carried in songs, whispered in prayers, carved into memory as though each syllable might suddenly come alive. But the waiting was not easy. Generations passed and no prophet rose. Some grew weary and ceased to look for anything more than survival under foreign rulers. Others grew restless, seizing upon every rumor of a holy man or visionary. Dreams, omens, and interpretations of Scripture multiplied, each promising that the silence was about to break. Among the faithful, the longing grew sharper. They spoke of Elijah returning, of the day of the Lord, of judgment and mercy arriving together. Every famine, every invasion, every change in empire was weighed as a possible sign. In this atmosphere, the scribes and teachers gained new authority. If God's voice was not freshly heard, then it must be found in the written word already given. They gathered students around scrolls, debated meanings, built fences of tradition around the law so that no one might again wander into disobedience. Prophecy had ceased, but interpretation flourished. The synagogue became a new center of life, a place where words of long-dead prophets were breathed into the ears of the living, keeping the silence from swallowing hope altogether. Still, there was an edge to the waiting. The people felt themselves caught between memory and promise, between what God had done and what he had sworn to do. The silence pressed them like a weight, but it also drew their gaze forward. They began to believe that the next word, when it came, would not be small. It would be as if the long pause were a prelude to thunder, as if heaven had gone quiet, only to prepare a voice that would shake the earth. Until then, they waited, carrying silence like a wound and a hope, trusting that God's voice, though absent, was not gone. Life in Judah under the shadow of Persia was marked less by grandeur than by endurance. The mighty empire stretched from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, swallowing nations like grains of sand, and Judah was but a small province within its vast belly. No king sat on David's throne. Instead, governors appointed by distant monarchs held authority, their decrees sealed with the emblem of a ruler most Judeans would never see. The Persians cared little for Judah's faith so long as taxes flowed and peace was kept. Soldiers marched along royal roads. Tribute caravans wound their way through the hills, and in Jerusalem the temple stood rebuilt, but lacking the splendor of Solomon's age. The rhythms of daily life carried on beneath the weight of empire. Farmers tilled terraced fields on stony hillsides, coaxing grain and olives from thin soil. Shepherds led their flocks through valleys, where watchtowers guarded against thieves. Traders crossed the land on their way to richer markets, their goods a reminder that Judah's fortunes were tied to powers far beyond its borders. Yet for all its smallness, the province endured as a people bound not by armies or wealth but by covenant. In the synagogues that began to emerge, men unrolled the scrolls of Torah, and children repeated the words of Moses until they were etched into memory. The temple remained the heart of Jerusalem's life, though the priests who served there often found themselves balancing piety with politics. Offerings were made daily, incense rose as always, and pilgrims still sang psalms as they ascended the hill of the Lord. But whispers lingered. Where was the glory cloud that once filled the sanctuary? Where was the fire that had fallen from heaven? The rituals continued, but the sense of God's immediate presence seemed veiled. Many clung to the promise that obedience in a time of silence would prepare the way for his return. Others felt the sharp edge of disappointment, wondering whether covenant blessing had slipped through their hands. Persian policy allowed conquered peoples to keep their traditions, yet it was tolerance born of pragmatism, not reverence. The empire's gods were many, its languages countless, its wealth staggering, and Judah was one more thread in its tapestry. For the faithful, this reality carried a humbling weight. They were chosen, yet they lived as subjects of kings who neither knew nor cared for the God of Abraham. And still they waited, praying that divine promises stretched beyond present humiliation. Children grew up hearing both the stories of old glory and the realities of current weakness. They learned of David who slew giants, of Solomon who built wonders, and then looked at their own city, patched and modest under foreign tax. Such contrast fed longing more than despair. For if God had once raised a shepherd to rule, if he had once filled a house with his presence, then surely he could do so again. Under Persia, Judah lived quietly, faithfully, restlessly like a candle flickering in a vast hall of shadows, small but unextinguished, waiting for the breath of God to stir its flame anew. When the prophets fell silent, the people turned to the words already given, and from this turning the scribes arose. They were not prophets with visions of fire and thunder, nor priests offering sacrifice before the altar, but guardians of text, keepers of memory. With ink-stained fingers and careful lips, they recited, copied, and explained the Torah, line upon line, until the living voice of God seemed to dwell in the very letters themselves. If heaven no longer thundered with new revelation, then perhaps heaven spoke in the steady cadence of study. In narrow rooms lit by oil lamps, students gathered around their teachers, repeating verses until they were fixed in memory like stones set into a wall. The scrolls became their prophets, the written word their guide. Debates grew over how best to interpret each command, each promise, each warning. Was the Sabbath made for rest alone, or did it demand boundaries that touched even the smallest tasks? What did it mean to honor parents in a world under foreign rule? The scribes sought to answer these questions not with visions but with precision, building fences of interpretation around the law so that no one might wander unknowing into transgression. The people, hungry for guidance, began to look to these teachers as they once looked to prophets. Priests still offered sacrifices in Jerusalem, but their influence was bound to the temple. The scribes, however, reached into every village. In synagogues rising across Judea and in faraway settlements of the diaspora, they gave shape to worship where no altar stood. Reading, prayer, and exposition formed a rhythm that carried Jewish life far beyond the temple courts. The word became portable, carried on tongues and hearts, guarded by those who devoted their lives to its careful keeping. This devotion, however, was not without its dangers. In their zeal to protect the law, some scribes piled rule upon rule until the heart of the command was hidden beneath layers of caution. Yet even this excess sprang from longing, a fear of repeating the sins that had once led to exile, a determination that silence from heaven should not mean silence from his people. The law became their lifeline, a way of hearing God in the absence of prophets, a way of remaining faithful when no new word came. Children grew up watching these men bend over scrolls, their whispers filling the air like prayer. Generations learned to measure holiness not by visions but by obedience, not by fire from heaven but by fidelity to written truth. The scribes could not summon God's voice, but they could keep it alive in ink and memory. And in their diligence the people discovered something profound, that the word already spoken was rich enough to sustain them, that prophecy had not truly ended but had been preserved in parchment, waiting for the day when silence would break and the living word himself would walk among them. The temple stood again on Mount Zion, not with the splendor of Solomon's golden courts, but with walls of stone and pillars plain enough to remind all who saw it that exile had left scars. Yet it was there, and for a people without a king, it became the heart of their identity. The second temple was not simply a building. It was a declaration that covenant still endured, that sacrifice still rose to heaven, that God's name had not been erased from the earth. Pilgrims climbed its steps at feast times with songs on their lips, carrying offerings as their fathers once had, believing that as long as the altar smoked, their nation still lived. Without a crown in Jerusalem, the priesthood carried authority once divided with kings. High priests presided not only over ritual but over the rhythm of national life. Their garments of white linen and gold spoke of continuity with Aaron, though their power was sharpened by politics as much as by piety. The Persian rulers looked to them to maintain order, and the people looked to them to preserve holiness. Between empire and covenant, they walked a narrow path. Some served faithfully, others bartered influence for favor, But all understood that the temple bound the people together more strongly than any palace could. Worship within its courts retained the ancient order. Morning and evening sacrifices rose like steady heartbeat. Incense clouded the air. Psalms echoed from Levite choirs. For those who came from distant villages, the sight of priests lifting lambs to the altar, the smell of blood mingled with burning flesh, the sound of trumpets at festival, these were reminders that heaven and earth still touched in this place. Children who had never seen a prophet could still look upon the altar and know their God had not abandoned them. Yet questions lingered. The Ark of the Covenant, once the center of the Holy of Holies, was gone. The dazzling presence that had filled Solomon's temple had not returned in visible form. The rituals were performed with precision, but the glory seemed veiled, as though God allowed his people to serve him while keeping his face hidden. Some wept at the dedication of the rebuilt house, remembering what once was. Others rejoiced that even without splendor, covenant life had been restored. Hope and longing mingled in every sacrifice, for worship in the Second Temple was both celebration and yearning, both obedience and petition for a greater glory to come. In the absence of a king, the temple became throne and court. Festivals bound the scattered tribes together, turning their eyes toward Jerusalem as the one place that still bore the mark of divine choice. The priests, though fallible, carried the weight of representation, mediating between heaven and earth in ways that shaped the people's imagination of what leadership should be. In those courts, faith was kept alive, awaiting the day when silence would end, and the Lord whom they sought would indeed come suddenly to his temple. From the west came a storm no one had foreseen, a youth barely grown to manhood whose name would soon shake empires. Alexander of Macedon, taught by Aristotle, trained in the art of war since childhood, rose like a flame against the fading shadow of Persia. The empire that had ruled from horizon to horizon now faced a challenger who moved with the swiftness of fire and the certainty of destiny. Battles that should have lasted days were decided in hours. The Persian kings, long accustomed to command, found themselves undone by a boy with the gaze of an eagle and the heart of a lion. Whispers of his victories traveled across deserts and mountains faster than his armies could march. From the plains of Issus to the fields of Gaugamela, Persia's hosts melted before him like wax before the sun. The world that had seemed eternal under Persian dominion cracked apart in less than a decade, and the small province of Judah watched from the hills as the order they had known gave way to something strange and dazzling. Merchants spoke in awe of the young conqueror. Priests prayed that their fragile temple might escape the storms of conquest, and children repeated his name in wonder. Alexander became less a man than a legend walking. Unlike empires that destroyed and rebuilt, Alexander carried a vision that the world might be bound together not only by his sword but by a common tongue, a shared culture. Greek speech spread through markets and garrisons. Greek gods appeared on foreign coins, and Greek ways of life began to seep into the bones of every land he touched. For Judea, this was both a threat and a promise. The law had kept them distinct through exile and empire, but now the very air carried a language not their own, a lure toward a wider world. When Alexander marched toward Jerusalem, fear gripped the people. Could their temple withstand his ambition? Yet legend tells of a night vision that stayed his wrath, of priests in white who met him at the gates, and of the conqueror bowing before the name greater than his own. Whether history or tale, the memory endured. Jerusalem was spared, and the people breathed again, but they knew the world had changed forever. The age of Persia's patient order was gone, replaced by the dazzling speed of Greek ambition. Alexander pressed on, dreaming of oceans yet to be crossed, of lands where the sun might never set on his rule. But at the height of his triumph, death came suddenly, striking him down at 32, leaving his vast conquests to be torn apart by generals who had once followed his banner. For the Jews, his coming was like lightning, brilliant, brief, and unforgettable. He had appeared, and in his wake the world was altered. A new language, a new culture, a new age had dawned, and the stage was being set for struggles that would test their faith more deeply than exile ever had. The death of Alexander did not silence his vision. Though his empire fractured under the weight of rival generals, his dream of a world bound together by Greek culture endured. Soldiers who had marched under his banner became settlers in distant lands, planting cities like seeds across Asia and the Mediterranean. These cities, with their theaters, gymnasiums, and marketplaces, became beacons of Hellenic life, radiating influence far beyond their walls. The world began to speak a new language, not merely of words but of thought, beauty, and power. Koine Greek spread like a river, flowing into valleys and deserts where it had never been heard before. Traders, scholars, and common folk alike found themselves drawn into its current. To know Greek was to have access to markets, literature, philosophy, and politics. Even in Judea, where Hebrew and Aramaic shaped prayer and family life, Greek words crept into conversation. Scrolls once guarded in a single tongue began to be translated, and the scriptures themselves would eventually speak in the language of Homer and Plato. The world was being knit together by a common voice. But Hellenization was more than language. It was the curve of marble statues, the contests of the gymnasium, the debates in shaded colonnades where philosophers asked what it meant to live well. It was the allure of reason, the pursuit of harmony, the celebration of human form and intellect. For many, these gifts felt like liberation, an opening to a world larger than their village or tribe. For others, it was seduction, a slow erosion of older loyalties, a temptation to forget the God who had called them apart. In Jerusalem, tensions simmered. Some young men longed for the vigor of Greek life, eager to race in gymnasiums or study rhetoric with philosophers. Others clung fiercely to covenant traditions, warning that to embrace Greek ways was to betray the law. Families found themselves divided, and the question of identity pressed harder with each passing year. Could one be both faithful to the God of Abraham and fluent in the wisdom of Athens? Or would one path eventually devour the other? The beauty of Hellenic art and the brilliance of its philosophy could not be denied. Yet beneath the marble and eloquence lurked gods carved in human likeness, myths that celebrated passions without restraint, and values that elevated human strength above divine holiness. For a people whose faith rested on the invisible God, who forbade images and demanded covenant loyalty, the clash was inevitable. Still, the tide of Hellenization could not be turned back. Roads, cities, and commerce carried it into every corner of the known world. Even those who resisted found themselves shaped by its currents, if only in opposition. The world had become Greek, and Judea, whether in resistance or adaptation, would have to find its place within it. Out of this tension between covenant and culture, Torah and philosophy, Jerusalem and Athens, the stage was set for a drama that would define the centuries to come and prepare the soil for the seeds of a greater kingdom yet to be revealed. Stories linger in the memory of a people longer than the stones of their walls, and among the Jews none was repeated more often in those restless years than the tale of Alexander's approach to Jerusalem. The conqueror had already broken Persia's pride, his armies sweeping across the Near East with the speed of a storm. Cities bowed before him, temples opened their doors to his gods, and no army seemed able to resist his will. When word spread that he was marching toward the holy city, fear rippled through the streets. The priests wondered whether the Second Temple, so recently restored and still fragile in its glory, would be torn down again. Mothers hushed their children with trembling voices, and elders whispered prayers, for who could stand against the Macedonian whose name already carried the weight of destiny? The high priest of the time, robed in white with the golden plate upon his brow, is said to have sought guidance in dreams. What he saw, so the story goes, was no command to resist but to welcome. And so, when Alexander came near, The gates of Jerusalem did not close in defiance but swung open. The priests, in their sacred garments, descended to meet him, a sight unlike anything the conqueror had seen in all his campaigns. Instead of trembling soldiers with drawn swords, there came a procession of holy men, their faces lit with solemn courage. Legend tells that when Alexander beheld the high priest, he did not strike, but bowed. His generals, astonished, demanded to know why the master of the world should honor a provincial priest. Alexander answered that before ever he marched east, he had seen this very figure in a dream, standing before him and promising victory over Persia. To him, this moment was not conquest but recognition, the fulfillment of a vision that had guided his steps. The people of Jerusalem, watching from the walls, must have gasped at the sight, the most powerful man alive lowering himself before the servant of their God. In that instant, hope surged that the covenant still held sway over kings and empires. The conqueror was received into the city not as destroyer but as guest. He was shown the temple, its rituals, its treasures. He offered respect, perhaps even sacrifice, not to his own gods, but in acknowledgement of the God whose name was spoken only in hushed reverence. Whether history or legend, the tale carried deep meaning. It told a people under foreign rule that their God was greater than empires, that even the mightiest bowed before him. It reminded them that Jerusalem's strength was not in walls or armies, but in the presence that dwelt within the temple. And though Alexander soon moved on, leaving his governors to order the land, the memory of that bow lingered. For generations afterward, Jews retold it as proof that heaven still watched over them, and that even in an age of Greek glory, the God of Israel remained Lord of kings. When Alexander died in Babylon, the world he had bound together unraveled almost at once. He was only 32, still burning with schemes of new conquests. Yet suddenly his voice was stilled, and the empire he had carved with speed and brilliance lay masterless. No son of his could take the throne with authority. His generals, men hardened by years of battle at his side, looked at one another with ambition in their eyes. They had sworn loyalty to him, but not to each other. The unity he had forced upon nations dissolved into rivalry, and the Macedonian dream of a single world gave way to endless struggle. The great empire split like glass under a hammer. Each general seized what he could hold, and the lands trembled as armies marched not against Persia now, but against one another. For the Jews, nestled in their small province, the fate of distant palaces mattered less than the question of who would hold the roads that cut across their hills. To the south, in Egypt, the Ptolemies established their court in Alexandria, a city of marble and light, where Greek culture flourished beside the Nile. To the north, in Syria, the Seleucids built their power, fierce and ambitious, stretching their hand toward Judea with the hunger of men who knew that whoever controlled the land between Egypt and Mesopotamia controlled the crossroads of empires. At first, the Ptolemies prevailed. Their rule was not without burden. Taxes were collected, soldiers garrisoned, but compared to harsher conquerors, their hand felt almost tolerable. Alexandria became a jewel of learning, its library swelling with books gathered from every land. It was under their influence that the Hebrew scriptures began to be rendered into Greek, so that even those who no longer spoke the ancient tongue might still hear the words of Moses and the prophets. For a time, Judea seemed to prosper, its people trading in wider markets, its priests permitted to continue temple service without interference. Yet the Seleucids to the north never ceased to cast their gaze southward. Armies clashed along the borders, campaigns rose and fell like waves, and each victory shifted the fate of Jerusalem. Sometimes banners of Egypt flew over the city gates, sometimes those of Syria. Families learned to measure their lives by which empire demanded their allegiance that year. Priests prayed for stability, but the ground beneath them was never still. The people longed for a king of their own, yet they were caught between powers far greater than themselves, pawns in a game of thrones played by men who cared little for their God. The death of Alexander had promised release from the shadow of one master, but instead it birthed many. The world was no longer one empire but several, locked in endless conflict, and Judea stood in the narrow strip of earth they all desired. Out of this instability would grow both opportunity and peril, for in the clash of Ptolemies and Seleucids the faith of Israel would be tested as never before, and the silence of God would seem deeper with each passing year. The world around Jerusalem had changed, and every street, every marketplace, every word spoken bore the marks of Greek influence. What began with Alexander's swift conquests had become daily reality. Coins carried the faces of foreign rulers crowned with laurel. Soldiers drilled in formation along the highways, their commands shouted in Greek. In the cities newly founded by the conquerors, theaters echoed with plays of gods and men, and gymnasiums displayed the human form in contests of strength and beauty. For many, it was dazzling. A culture that seemed richer, sharper, more alive than anything they had known before. Yet for the people of the covenant, the allure of Hellenism carried a shadow. In Judea, the Torah had always marked the boundaries of life. The law told them what to eat, how to live, when to rest, and how to worship. To forget even a small command was to risk unfaithfulness to the God who had chosen them. Now a new world pressed in, urging them to bend those boundaries, to taste what had been forbidden, to call wisdom what their fathers called folly. Young men found themselves drawn to the gymnasium, where names were changed to sound more Greek and circumcision became a mark of shame. Merchants learned Greek phrases to bargain in broader markets. Even scholars debated whether philosophy from Athens might be reconciled with the wisdom of Moses. Families divided over these questions. Fathers urged sons to remain faithful, to guard the covenant as their ancestors had in exile. Sons replied that the world had shifted, that power and learning belonged to those who embraced the new ways. Some believed they could balance both, wearing Greek garments in the street but keeping Torah in the home. Others chose one path or the other entirely, either clinging fiercely to their traditions or casting them off for the promise of prestige under Greek rulers. The priests and scribes found themselves standing in the breach, striving to preserve purity when their people were tempted to dissolve into the currents of culture. The synagogue became not only a place of worship but a shield, where the old words were rehearsed against the noise of the new. Yet even within the temple, disputes arose. How far could they yield to foreign powers while still remaining faithful? Was compromise wisdom or betrayal? The tension became the rhythm of daily life. Markets hummed with Greek speech, yet prayers rose in Hebrew and Aramaic. Statues of foreign gods stood in neighboring cities, while Jerusalem's temple remained free of image. Children grew up knowing both Homer and Moses, both Plato and the Psalms of David. Each generation faced the same question: to whom would they belong? For some, the Greek world was an opportunity, a door into wider horizons. For others, it was a danger that threatened to erase their very identity. In that struggle between assimilation and faithfulness, between Athens and Zion, the story of the silent years unfolded. It was a tension that would shape not only their survival but the stage upon which the voice of God would one day return. From the gleaming palaces of Alexandria, the Ptolemaic kings stretched their hand over Judea. Egypt had once enslaved Israel in its youth, and now, centuries later, it bound the nation again, though with tribute and governors rather than whips and chains. The Ptolemies, heirs of Alexander in the south, ruled with the splendor of pharaohs and the sophistication of Greeks. Their capital glittered by the sea, a city crowned with the great lighthouse at Pharos, and filled with scholars who gathered the wisdom of the world into its library. From there, decrees reached the hills of Judea, reminding the people that their fate was decided in a city far from Zion. Yet life under Egyptian dominion was not without a strange measure of peace. The Ptolemies were more interested in wealth than in crushing the faith of their subjects. Taxes pressed heavily, but the temple still stood. Pilgrims could still climb its steps. priests could still offer sacrifices, and the songs of psalms still rose on holy days. For a time, the silence of God seemed less harsh under rulers who did not demand new gods in place of the old. Still, the mark of Egypt was everywhere. Greek administrators oversaw commerce, ensuring that the riches of Judea flowed toward Alexandria. Soldiers garrisoned key towns, a reminder that obedience was enforced not only by law but by spears. And slowly, inevitably, Greek customs seeped into Jewish life. The young learned the language of trade. The wealthy decorated their homes with foreign art. Even the scriptures themselves were translated into Greek for the many Jews who had grown up in the diaspora and no longer understood Hebrew. This translation, the Septuagint, spread the words of Moses and the prophets across the empire, yet it also reminded the faithful that exile was not just physical but cultural. Within Jerusalem, the high priests held precarious power, mediators not only between God and people but between nation and empire. Some navigated this role with caution, preserving worship while appeasing their overlords. Others leaned toward ambition, securing favor in Alexandria at the cost of trust at home. The people watched with mixed feelings, grateful for stability, yet wary of compromise, fearing that loyalty to Torah might be slowly eroded beneath the weight of foreign influence. For common folk, life was a balance of endurance and hope. Farmers sowed and reaped under the same sun. Shepherds guided their flocks along ancient paths, and families gathered in synagogues to recite the words that anchored them to covenant. Yet each festival reminded them that they lived under a dynasty that neither knew nor loved their God. Egypt's dominion was a season of uneasy calm. Judea endured, the temple remained, and the people still called on the Lord of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But they knew they were not free. Their prayers carried both gratitude for survival and longing for deliverance, echoing the memory of Moses and the promise of a king yet to come. In the silence of heaven, under the shadow of Alexandria, the waiting deepened. On the shores of Egypt, where the Mediterranean waves kissed marble quays, Alexandria rose as a city unlike any other. Founded by Alexander's own hand, it became the jewel of the Ptolemies, a meeting place of nations, languages, and gods. At its heart stood the library, vast and insatiable, gathering scrolls from every corner of the known world. Merchant ships entering the harbor were searched not only for cargo but for manuscripts, which were copied and stored in chambers scented with papyrus and cedar. Knowledge itself became the treasure of kings, and Alexandria their vault. Among the countless texts sought for preservation were the writings of the Jews, the law, and the prophets, words spoken on desert sands and mountain heights, now requested for a city that prized wisdom from all peoples. Many Jews had long since settled in Egypt, scattered after exile, their children speaking Greek more easily than the tongue of their ancestors. For them, the sacred words in Hebrew grew distant, like an heirloom locked away, admired but no longer understood. The time had come for translation, that the voice of their God might be heard again in the language of their daily lives. So began the work of the Septuagint, a rendering of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. Tradition tells of 72 elders, summoned from Jerusalem, each working separately yet producing the same words, a miracle of unity. Whether history or legend, the story endured because it captured what the people longed to believe, that even in a foreign tongue, the breath of God still lingered in His word. When the translation was read aloud, Jews in Alexandria could hear the voice of Moses and Isaiah in the language of Homer and Plato, proof that their covenant was not bound to one land or one language alone. The Septuagint did more than preserve faith for scattered Jews. It carried the scriptures into the bloodstream of the Greek world. Philosophers who once pondered the myths of Olympus now encountered the God who declared Himself one. Scholars who studied the stars found themselves reading of a Creator who called them forth by name. Even Gentiles, curious about this peculiar people, could now open a scroll and discover commandments and promises that had shaped generations. Yet for all its triumph, the translation stirred unease. Some feared that words carried in Greek would lose the depth of Hebrew, that holy mysteries would be flattened into common speech. Others worried that too much intimacy with Hellenism might dilute devotion, making Israel's God seem only one voice among many. Still, the work continued, for silence was a greater danger than distortion. Better that the covenant be heard imperfectly than forgotten altogether. Thus the great library preserved the words of the prophets, and the Septuagint spread them across a world knit together by Greek speech. In the hush between Malachi and Matthew, when no new prophet walked among them, the ancient voices were carried farther than ever before. The silence of heaven remained, but the word of God traveled on the wind of another tongue, waiting for the day it would take on flesh and speak again. In the days when no king sat on David's throne, the high priests rose to fill the space where crown and scepter once ruled. Their calling had been sacred, to offer sacrifice and guard the sanctity of the temple. But under foreign dominion their role stretched beyond altar and incense into the tangled realm of politics. They became not only mediators between God and people, but negotiators with governors, ambassadors to distant courts, and often pawns in the ambitions of empires. The Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria both understood the power of Jerusalem's priesthood. To control the high priest was to hold sway over Judea, for the people still looked to the temple as the heart of their identity. Thus the office became a prize coveted not only for devotion but for influence. Families of priestly descent maneuvered for advantage, seeking favor from foreign kings who appointed or dismissed high priests according to their own interests. Holiness was mingled with politics, and what should have been service to God often became service to men. Some high priests bore the weight with dignity, striving to protect the temple and preserve peace, even when compromise was unavoidable. They collected tribute to satisfy distant rulers, ensuring that sacrifices could continue and festivals could be kept without disruption. Their caution spared Jerusalem from destruction in turbulent times, yet it also bred suspicion. Many whispered that piety was too easily sacrificed upon the altar of expedience. Others openly resented that holy garments might be worn by men who purchased the office with silver rather than inherited it with reverence. The priesthood became divided, rival claimants contending for the role, each backed by foreign patrons. Intrigue spread through the holy city, and sacred vestments were passed not as inheritance but as spoils of politics. The altar still smoked with offerings, the choirs still sang psalms, but behind the sanctuary's veil the shadow of corruption grew heavier. The people saw it, and though they continued to climb the temple steps, their trust in those who presided there was weakened. For common folk, the tension was wearying. They longed for leaders who would embody both holiness and justice, who would stand unbending before foreign rulers as Moses once had before Pharaoh. Instead, they often saw men torn between devotion and ambition, guardians of covenant who also acted as governors of tribute. Each change in high priest brought new uncertainty. Would he guard the Torah with zeal, or would he bend the law to please a foreign king? Yet even in this tangled web, the hand of providence was at work. The entanglement of priesthood and politics revealed the limits of human leadership, showing a people that no office, however sacred, could bear the weight of their hope. The longing for a true high priest, one who would not barter holiness for power, deepened. In the silence of God's voice and the compromises of men, a hunger grew for the day when heaven itself would raise a leader untouched by corruption, whose authority would not depend on empires but on the very will of God. Far from the hills of Judah, Jewish life was taking root in foreign soil. The exile had scattered them, and though many returned to rebuild Jerusalem and its temple, countless others remained where they had been planted, forming communities across the breadth of the known world. Now, under the long shadow of Greek rule, the diaspora grew, weaving Jewish presence into the fabric of distant cities. Chief among these was Alexandria, the shining jewel of Egypt, where the Nile met the sea and cultures mingled in a restless harmony. In Alexandria, Jews found both opportunity and tension. The city's wide avenues and marble colonnades promised prosperity to those who adapted, and many did. Merchants traded in bustling markets. Scholars debated alongside Greeks, and families flourished in quarters where Hebrew prayers rose even as Greek philosophy echoed nearby. They built synagogues, not temples, places where the word of God was read aloud and prayers replaced sacrifices. In these halls, the law traveled farther than Jerusalem, sustaining faith in lands where no priest burned incense and no altar stood. Yet the challenge of life abroad was constant. Children grew up hearing Greek more often than Hebrew, studying Homer beside the Torah, living between two worlds. Some embraced this blending, believing that the wisdom of their fathers could sit beside the philosophy of Athens. Others feared dilution, that covenant distinctiveness would vanish in the flood of foreign culture. In every household the question lingered: how to live as a people set apart while dwelling among the nations. Still, the diaspora was not only a challenge, it became a vessel for survival. When wars shook Judea, when empires shifted and armies marched, Jewish life abroad ensured the faith did not perish with the land. Synagogues anchored identity, festivals were kept, and children were taught to remember Zion even if they had never seen it. The Psalms that spoke of rivers of Babylon and longings for Jerusalem still found voice generations later, sung in cities where the temple's smoke had never risen. Alexandria itself became a center of Jewish thought, a place where scripture was not only preserved but translated into the Greek tongue so that scattered Jews could still hear God's word. The Septuagint, born there, ensured that the covenant voice reached both Jew and Gentile. What had begun as necessity for a dispersed people became a bridge through which nations beyond Israel could glimpse the God of Abraham. And so the diaspora expanded westward into Rome, eastward into Babylon, south into Egypt, north into Asia Minor. Everywhere they went, Jews carried with them scrolls, prayers, and a fierce memory of Jerusalem. They lived as strangers and neighbors, loyal to the laws of their host cities, yet bound to a higher law that no empire could erase. The temple in Jerusalem remained their heart, but the synagogues abroad became its echo, keeping covenant alive in foreign tongues and foreign lands. In this scattering, painful yet providential, God was preparing the world for a day when His word would no longer dwell in one place, but spread like light to every corner of the earth. In the long silence after Malachi, when prophets no longer thundered from the hills of Judah, the people turned to visions and dreams to make sense of their suffering. The world seemed ruled by empires that rose like beasts and fell like fading stars, and in their shadow Israel wrestled with questions of justice. If God's covenant was sure, why did foreign kings trample His people? If the temple still stood, why did heaven remain so silent? Out of that tension grew a new kind of writing, urgent and mysterious, where history was cast in symbols and the present moment seen through the lens of eternity. These were the beginnings of apocalyptic thought. Seers spoke not in plain words, but in images that burned themselves into memory beasts with many heads, horns rising and falling, thrones of fire. Books opened in heaven. The language was veiled, yet it carried hope to those who listened closely. Behind the masks of beasts stood empires, Persia, Greece. Powers yet to come, each rising for a season but destined to collapse before the kingdom of God. Where prophets once warned of judgment for sin, these visions promised that the faithful, though trampled, would be vindicated, and that the Most High still ruled over the affairs of men. The book of Daniel, though set in Babylon's exile, spoke freshly to a people under new masters. Its tales of lions' dens and fiery furnaces encouraged courage under oppression, while its visions of statues and beasts painted history as a stage moving toward God's climactic intervention. In the diaspora, especially in Alexandria and Babylon, other writings began to echo this voice. Weaving cosmic imagery with present suffering, they told of heavenly secrets revealed to chosen men, of hidden books waiting for the last days, of angels and demons locked in battle unseen, yet shaping the fate of nations. Such writings were not mere escape from hardship. They were acts of defiance, declaring that though foreign kings claimed dominion, their power was fleeting. The true king was enthroned above, and his judgment would shatter every empire in its time. For ordinary Jews paying taxes to foreign governors, these visions kept hope alive that injustice was not final. The silence of prophets did not mean abandonment. It was the pause before revelation of an even greater kind. Apocalyptic thought gave voice to both despair and faith. It acknowledged the terror of foreign armies, the humiliation of compromise, the pain of exile within one's own land. Yet it also lifted eyes beyond present suffering to a horizon where God himself would act, not through gradual change, but through a decisive breaking in of eternity. These seeds, sown in the soil of oppression, would one day flower in the language of John the Baptist, in the sermons of Jesus, and in the visions of Revelation. But here, in the centuries after Malachi, they began as whispers in the dark. Words of fire passed quietly among the faithful, promising that the kingdoms of this world would become the kingdom of God and of his Christ. From the north arose a ruler whose name would soon echo through the valleys of Judea with dread Antiochus of the Seleucid line. He was born into an empire already forged in struggle, for the heirs of Alexander grasped at fragments of a broken dream. Yet Antiochus was not content with what had been handed down. Ambition burned within him, and his eyes turned westward, to lands beyond Syria, to Egypt, to the Mediterranean itself, as if the ghost of Alexander whispered in his ear that only the whole world was enough. He strengthened his armies, not only with soldiers hardened by battle, but with elephants that shook the earth when they marched, beasts that made men tremble before the clash of spears had even begun. His court gleamed with wealth drawn from conquered cities, and his word reached far into territories once claimed by rivals. Antiochus styled himself Epiphanes, God manifest, a title heavy with arrogance, suggesting not only kingly power but divine presence in his person. To many it was blasphemy, to him it was destiny. Egypt became his chosen prize, a kingdom of ancient power now under the Ptolemies. Twice he descended upon it, sweeping across its borders with the might of his legions. Cities fell before him, and Alexandria itself seemed within his grasp. For a moment it appeared as though the Seleucid Empire would stretch from Mesopotamia to the Nile, restoring in part the grandeur of Alexander's vision. But his ambition drew the gaze of powers greater still. From across the sea came Rome, no longer a distant republic but a rising colossus whose shadow lengthened over the east. At a crucial moment, Roman envoys stood before Antiochus and ordered him to withdraw from Egypt. Their words carried no army with them, yet their authority was iron. The story was told of how they drew a circle in the sand around him and demanded his decision before he stepped out of it. Antiochus, humiliated, turned back, seething with rage he could not unleash against Rome. It was in this frustration that his eyes settled on Jerusalem. Judea was a small province, yet it lay at the crossroads of empires, and its people, stubborn in their devotion to one God, stood as a challenge to Hellenistic order. Antiochus believed that unity of culture was the key to his strength, and resistance to Greek ways appeared to him as rebellion. If he could not have Egypt, he would tighten his grip elsewhere, and the Jews would feel the weight of his fury. In Antiochus, ambition swelled into overreach, and arrogance ripened into cruelty. His hunger for glory drove him beyond wisdom, and his wrath at defeat turned against those least able to resist. The stage was being set for a conflict unlike any Judea had yet endured, one in which faith itself would be tested in the crucible of oppression. For the people of the covenant, Antiochus was no mere king. He became the embodiment of the age's darkness, a tyrant whose shadow stretched over their temple and their lives. The clash between covenant and culture did not always come through swords and armies. Often it came in quieter ways, in the streets and homes of Jerusalem itself. Greek influence pressed not only from foreign rulers but from the lives of neighbors, reshaping customs, desires, and dreams. What began as curiosity became contest, a struggle for the very soul of Israel. The gymnasium rose as a symbol of this struggle. In Greek eyes, it was a place of honor, where young men trained their bodies, competed for glory, and learned the arts of speech and leadership. To join its ranks was to step into the prestige of Hellenic life, to be counted among those who carried the torch of civilization. But to faithful Jews, the gymnasium was a place of shame. Nakedness, celebrated as beauty by the Greeks, exposed the mark of circumcision that bound them to Abraham's covenant. Some youths even sought to conceal their heritage through painful procedures, eager to erase the sign of their fathers in order to gain acceptance among their peers. To some, this was liberation. To others, it was betrayal. Philosophy, too, crept into their schools and synagogues. The teachings of Plato and Aristotle asked questions not unlike those the prophets once raised. What is justice? What is the good life? Yet the answers often led away from the fear of the Lord toward reason enthroned as supreme. Rabbis and scribes debated whether Greek wisdom could be grafted onto the root of Torah, or whether it was a foreign vine that would choke the covenant tree. Some admired the sharpness of Greek logic and sought to harmonize it with their own traditions, while others warned that Athens could never sit beside Zion without one eventually devouring the other. Intermarriage added another layer to the division. For generations, the law had guarded Israel's identity through the boundaries of family and tribe, reminding them that they were a people set apart. But love and ambition paid little heed to such barriers. Wealthy Jews sought alliances with Greek families, sealing bonds not with covenant but with convenience. Children born of such unions grew up between worlds, sometimes welcomed in both, often belonging fully to neither. For conservative voices, this was evidence of decline, a blurring of sacred lines that threatened to dissolve the people into the nations around them. These conflicts did not remain abstract. They split households and communities. Brothers quarreled over whether to send their sons to Greek schools. Elders watched in sorrow as young men left behind synagogue study for the lure of athletic contests. Families argued over the place of foreign customs at their tables, festivals, and marriages. The unity of Israel frayed, not by foreign armies, but by choices made within their own gates. The cultural wars cut deeper than political domination, for they reached into identity itself. Was Israel still the holy nation chosen at Sinai, or merely another province in the Greek world? This question echoed in every debate, every compromise, every prayer whispered in the shadow of the gymnasium. It was a conflict without clear battle lines, but its wounds prepared the ground for greater storms yet to come. The priesthood, once the sacred office of Aaron's sons, descended in those years into a contest of ambition and silver. What had been a calling to holiness became a prize to be bought, sold, and bargained for in the courts of kings. Foreign rulers quickly discovered that control of Jerusalem could be secured more easily with coins than with swords, for the high priest carried authority not only over sacrifices but over the nation's conscience. Whoever wore the breastplate and entered the sanctuary stood as both spiritual leader and political governor, and men of greedy heart began to crave that power. Bribery replaced reverence. Rival claimants from priestly families journeyed to Antioch or Alexandria, carrying gifts for kings and promises of loyalty. Those who offered the richest tribute often returned home with decrees in their favor, while their rivals were stripped of office regardless of their piety. Sacred garments passed not as inheritance but as tokens of political favor, and the people watched in dismay as the holiest role in Israel was treated as a commodity in the marketplace of empires. The corruption did not stop at appointment. High priests enriched themselves from temple treasuries, extracting heavy tithes while living in luxury. Some aligned themselves openly with Hellenistic policies, building Greek institutions and adopting foreign customs in hopes of winning royal approval. Others suppressed rivals with violence, sending guards to enforce their authority within the very courts of the temple. Worshippers ascending to offer sacrifice often found the air heavy, not with the scent of incense, but with the bitterness of intrigue and bloodshed. The faithful mourned these changes. To them, the high priest was meant to be a mediator, one who carried the sins of the people into the presence of God, one whose robe and turban spoke of purity and humility. Instead, they saw men eager for titles, feasting while the poor hungered, bowing to foreign idols in their hearts while pretending to serve the altar. The cries of prophets once thundered against such hypocrisy, but now prophecy was silent, and the people endured in grief. Yet even in this corruption, a strange kind of preparation was unfolding. The disillusionment with priestly leaders deepened the longing for something greater. A high priest who would not sell his soul for gold. One who would remain faithful not to kings but to the Lord himself. Each act of bribery, each betrayal, each quarrel among unworthy priests pressed the people closer to despair, but also to hope that God himself would one day raise a leader who could not be corrupted. The corruption of the priesthood revealed more than human weakness. It exposed the futility of placing ultimate trust in men. The temple still stood, sacrifices still burned, prayers still rose, but the office meant to guard holiness had become entangled in politics and greed. And so the people waited, caught between despair at what was and longing for what might be, yearning for the day when holiness would return not through bribes and bargains, but through a priest who truly bore the presence of God. From the fractured throne of the Seleucids emerged a figure whose name would be remembered with bitterness in every Jewish home. Antiochus IV, who called himself Epiphanes' God manifest, seized power with cunning and audacity, though many whispered he had no rightful claim. Some called him Epimanes instead, the madman, for his behavior swung between theatrical generosity and reckless cruelty. Yet behind his eccentricities lay a cold determination to forge his realm into one united people under one culture, and to erase any stubborn nation that resisted. Antiochus had seen the limits of empire. His father and brother had wrestled with Rome, paying tribute and bowing to foreign will. He burned with humiliation at their weakness and vowed to restore Seleucid greatness, whatever the cost. To achieve it, he turned not only to armies but to ideology. Greek identity, he believed, must be pressed upon every subject until diversity vanished. Language, custom, worship, these were tools of unity, and any people who clung to their old ways threatened the fabric of his rule. It was Judea that soon drew his wrath. The Jews, scattered yet resilient, refused to yield the heart of their faith. The law of Moses bound them, the temple defined them, and the covenant distinguished them from all nations. Their refusal to blend in was, to Antiochus, not quaint piety, but rebellion. Already the priesthood in Jerusalem had been corrupted. Already Greek customs crept through the city streets. But for Antiochus this was not enough. He would stamp out their difference entirely, silencing their scriptures, defiling their temple, and forcing them into the mold of the Hellenistic world. At first, his measures were political, shifting high priests as though they were pieces on a game board, selling the sacred office to the highest bidder. But soon his ambitions darkened. He raided the temple treasury, seizing vessels dedicated to God, and when murmurs of resistance stirred, he struck with fury. Soldiers marched through Jerusalem, slaughtering in the streets, and decrees were issued forbidding circumcision, Sabbath-keeping, or sacrifices according to the law. Altars to foreign gods were raised, swine were offered in desecration, and the holy place itself was turned into a stage for blasphemy. The people were crushed beneath terror. Mothers who circumcised their sons saw them killed before their eyes. Scrolls of the Torah were torn and burned, their owners executed. What had begun as cultural tension now became open persecution. an attempt not just to rule a people but to erase their faith from the earth. Yet even in the face of such cruelty, seeds of defiance began to stir. The oppression of Antiochus Epiphanes, meant to extinguish covenant loyalty, instead fanned it into flame. His madness revealed the cost of compromise, and his tyranny drew lines that could not be blurred. In his arrogance, he believed he could crush the God of Israel by crushing his people. Instead, he awakened a resistance that would burn fiercer than any altar he had defiled. The moment that had long been feared came with a weight that seemed to crack the very stones of Jerusalem. Antiochus Epiphanes, already known for his fury and blasphemy, struck at the heart of Israel's faith. The temple, the place chosen for God's name to dwell, was seized and stripped of its sanctity. Soldiers marched through its courts with foreign banners, their footsteps echoing where psalms once rose. The altar of burnt offering, consecrated since the days of Ezra, was torn down, and in its place a new altar was built, not for the God of Abraham, but for Zeus Olympios, the thunderer of Greece. It was not enough that the holy vessels had been carried away, or that blood had already stained the sanctuary. Antiochus demanded that worship itself be transformed. Sacrifices of swine, unclean in the law, were laid upon the altar where lambs once bore the sins of the people. Smoke rose thick and acrid, not as a pleasing offering but as an insult hurled toward heaven. Statues of Greek gods were paraded into the courts, and images of Zeus overshadowed the space where only the invisible God was to be honored. The sacred precinct became a theater of blasphemy, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of by Daniel now standing in dreadful reality. The priests who remained were powerless or complicit. Some, fearing the king's wrath, participated in the desecration, their robes soiled not by blood of atonement but by betrayal. Others fled, unwilling to witness what their eyes could not endure. The daily sacrifices ceased, silencing a rhythm that had sustained Israel for centuries. To the faithful, it seemed as though creation itself had stopped breathing. In the city, despair and fury mingled. Mothers wept for sons slain for clinging to the covenant. Fathers tore their garments at the news of the sanctuary's defilement. Some abandoned hope, believing God had turned away forever. Others clenched their fists, swearing vengeance in whispers, waiting for a moment to strike. Every festival that passed without offerings, every Sabbath mocked by foreign decrees, deepened the wound in Israel's soul. Yet even in that darkness, a strange clarity emerged. For generations, compromise with Greek culture had blurred the line between faith and assimilation. Now the line was carved in blood and fire. To bow before Zeus was to renounce the covenant. To refuse was to risk death. There could be no middle ground. The abomination in the temple, meant to erase Israel's faith, became the crucible that purified it. The temple stood, but not as it had been. Its stones bore witness to the arrogance of men who thought they could replace the eternal with idols of their own making. But the memory of its defilement would burn in the hearts of the faithful, kindling a resolve that no decree could quench. For though the altar smoked with swine's flesh and idols mocked the holy place, the people of the covenant believed the sanctuary belonged not to Antiochus, nor to Zeus, but to the God who had promised his dwelling there forever. It happened not in the halls of power, but in the quiet hills of Judea, where an aging priest named Mattathias lived with his sons. He was no warrior by birth, no prince by station, but a man of covenant, rooted in the law of his fathers. When Antiochus's decrees reached his village, demanding sacrifice to foreign gods, the air grew heavy with dread. Soldiers arrived with orders to enforce obedience, and an altar to idols was raised in the very heart of the town. The people were summoned to bow, and promises of reward were whispered for those who complied. The officer of the king spoke with practiced confidence, singling out Mattathias as the elder of his people. "You are respected," he said, "an honorable man with many sons. If you will set the example and offer sacrifice to Zeus, all will follow. You will be honored by the king, and your house will prosper." His words carried both temptation and threat, but Mattathias's eyes blazed with fire. "Though all nations obey the king, I and my sons and my brothers will walk in the covenant of our fathers," he declared. "We will not forsake the law, nor bow to idols." Even as he spoke, another man from among the Jews stepped forward, trembling but eager to save his life. He moved toward the altar to make the forbidden offering. In that moment, Mattathias's wrath overflowed. With sudden violence, he struck down both the apostate Jew and the king's officer, spilling their blood before the idol's stones. The village erupted in cries of shock and fear. What had been a scene of submission was transformed into the spark of rebellion. Mattathias tore down the altar, shouting to the gathered crowd, "Whoever is zealous for the law and faithful to the covenant, follow me!" His sons rallied to him: John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan, and with them a small band of the faithful fled into the wilderness. Behind them the village lay stunned, caught between terror of the king's reprisal and awe at the priest's defiance. Before them stretched a future uncertain. But one thing was clear: the yoke of Antiochus would not be borne in silence any longer. From that act, the revolt was born. The hills and caves became their refuge, the forests their strongholds. Farmers, shepherds, and villagers trickled to their side, men weary of oppression and stirred by the memory of covenant faith. They carried no great weapons, only stones, knives, and determination, yet in their hearts burned a fire no Seleucid army could extinguish. The blood spilled at the village altar had written a new chapter, one not of compromise but of resistance. What Antiochus had meant as humiliation had given birth to defiance. In the wilderness, a priest and his sons became leaders of a movement that would shake empires. The silence of generations was broken by the cry of revolt, and from the ashes of despair rose the first breath of hope that God had not abandoned his people, and that covenant was worth blood as well as breath. From the wilderness rose a leader whose very name would become a banner of defiance. Judah, son of Mattathias, took command after his father's death, and the people soon called him Maccabee the Hammer for the force of his blows against the oppressor. He was not king nor high priest, but something greater in that hour, a man anointed by necessity, sharpened by suffering, and driven by zeal for the covenant. Where Antiochus's armies marched with elephants and phalanxes, Judah struck with speed and fury, wielding faith as much as sword. His strategy was born of the land itself. He knew the hills, the valleys, the caves where fugitives could hide and fighters could gather. By night his band moved like shadows. By day they vanished into forests and mountains. They struck when least expected, harassing garrisons, cutting supply lines, and ambushing columns weighed down by arrogance and armor. Against disciplined formations, Judah's men had little chance in open fields, but in narrow passes and rocky slopes, they became lions among sheep. Victories, small at first, soon multiplied, and each one swelled the courage of the faithful. Word spread quickly through Judea. Antiochus's soldiers were not invincible. Stories of Maccabees' triumphs traveled from village to village, and more men joined the cause, bringing whatever weapons they could muster. Some bore rusted swords or bows, others nothing more than farm tools, yet all carried within them a flame that had been kindled by oppression and now fed by hope. Women and children supported the fighters with food and shelter, while elders lifted prayers in secret, believing once more that heaven had not abandoned them. The Seleucid governors, enraged by their defeats, sent larger forces to crush the rebels. But each campaign ended in humiliation, for Judah fought not only with cunning but with conviction. Before battle he rallied his men with words that stirred their souls. "It is not the size of the army that gives victory, but the strength that comes from the Lord." They charged with cries that shook the hills, and more than once the mighty fled before the few. One victory in particular sent tremors through the land. At the pass of Beth Horon, Judah's outnumbered fighters struck down a force many times their size, seizing weapons and armor left behind in the rout. The people who had once hidden in caves now lifted their heads with pride. Songs of deliverance rose where laments had long been sung, and children played in streets once darkened by fear. Judah's victories did more than win ground. They restored courage. The covenant was no longer a fading memory, but a living flame carried in the hands of men willing to die for it. Antiochus still ruled with iron decrees, but in the hills of Judea the hammer had begun to strike, and every blow rang out as a promise that Israel would not bow. The revolt was no longer a whisper, it had become the roar of a people awakened, ready to carve freedom from the heart of tyranny. At last the day came when Judah Maccabee and his followers climbed the slope of Mount Zion, not as fugitives but as victors. For 3 years they had fought in the hills, striking like thunder against Antiochus's forces, and now the enemy had been driven from Jerusalem. Yet when they entered the city, triumph turned to sorrow. The temple, once the pride of Israel, lay defiled. Its courts were overgrown and broken, its altars blackened by swine's blood, its holy vessels stolen or shattered. The sanctuary that had been the meeting place of heaven and earth stood as a ruin of shame. Judah and his men tore their garments at the sight. Tears fell as they walked through the desecrated courts, and anger flared at every reminder of foreign blasphemy. But grief gave way to resolve. They would not leave the sanctuary in ruins. They would cleanse it, restore it, and dedicate it again to the God of their fathers. What had been defiled by arrogance and idolatry would once more be set apart for holiness. The work began with urgency. Foreign idols were cast down and destroyed. Stones of the polluted altar were dismantled and carried away to a place unclean, left as a testimony until a prophet might say what should be done with them. A new altar was built from unhewn stones, pure and untouched by human tool, and the priests prepared it with careful rites. The lampstand was set in place again, though its golden branches were fewer and less ornate than before. The sanctuary was furnished with new vessels, hastily crafted but dedicated with trembling hands. When the day of dedication came, the people gathered with hearts full of awe. They offered sacrifices according to the law, and incense rose once more from the altar of prayer. Psalms rang out in voices both hoarse from battle and joyous with hope. For the first time in years, the temple was alive again, its courts filled with worship rather than mockery. A tradition took root from that rededication, remembered in the lighting of lamps. Though oil for the menorah was scarce, the story was told that what little they found, enough for a single day, continued to burn until new oil could be prepared. Whether by miracle or memory, the light became a sign of God's favor, proof that his presence had not abandoned his people even in their darkest hour. For 8 days the celebration continued, echoing the Feast of Tabernacles that war had long prevented, until joy replaced sorrow and the people knew again the sweetness of freedom. Thus, Hanukkah was born not merely as a festival of lights, but as a testimony that covenant faith endures even against empires. The temple stood purified, the altar restored, and the name of God exalted in the very place where his enemies had sought to erase it. What Antiochus had defiled, Judah and his people had made holy once more, and their victory was remembered not only in battle songs but in the flicker of every lamp lit in the days of dedication. The name of Judah Maccabee had become a terror to the Seleucids and a song upon the lips of Israel. For years he struck with daring and faith, scattering armies larger than his own, until the land once bowed under Antiochus began to breathe again. But no man, however mighty, escapes the turning of time. The day came when the hammer was tested beyond his strength, and his blood joined the soil he had fought to redeem. It happened when the Seleucid generals, weary of humiliation, resolved to crush the revolt once and for all. They gathered a vast army, cavalry and elephants, seasoned troops arrayed in gleaming armor. Against them Judah could muster only a fraction of their number. His followers urged him to retreat, to bide his time, to wait for a more favorable hour. But Judah's heart would not yield. "Far be it from me to flee," he told them. "If our time is come, let us die as men fighting for our people and for the sanctuary." His words lit a fire in many, yet sorrow shadowed their courage, for they knew what lay before them. The battle was fierce and desperate. Judah and his men fought with the ferocity of lions, striking again and again at the enemy's flanks. Dust and smoke veiled the sun, and the cries of the wounded rose like thunder. But numbers overwhelmed them. Judah pressed forward into the thick of the fight, seeking to break the enemy's center, his sword flashing like lightning. There, surrounded, he fell, still striking until his last breath. His body lay amid heaps of the slain, and the land trembled at the loss of its champion. When word spread that the hammer was dead, grief covered Judea like a shroud. Men and women wept openly in the streets. Children asked how they would stand without him, and for a moment despair threatened to undo the gains won with blood. Yet Judah's death did not extinguish the fire he had kindled. His brothers Jonathan, Simon, and the rest rose to carry on where he had fallen. They gathered the remnant of his fighters, nursed their wounds, and swore that his cause would not perish with him. Judah's life had become more than his victories. It was a testimony that faith could resist empires. Though his enemies rejoiced at his death, they could not kill what he had awakened. In every village and field, men remembered his courage and whispered his name as prayer and promise. His fall was heavy, but it did not break the people. Instead, it pressed them deeper into their resolve. Thus the hammer was laid down, but the war did not end. Judah's blood became seed, and from it grew new strength. His brothers bore the weight of leadership, and Israel's struggle endured. The man was gone, but the covenant remained, and the memory of his defiance continued to strike blows long after his sword was still. In the shadow of Judah's death, many thought the revolt would wither, but his brothers refused to let the flame die. Jonathan, youngest of the surviving sons, stepped into the place of leadership. He was not the hammer, fierce and unbending, but he possessed a different gift, the patience of a fox and the subtlety of a diplomat. In a time when empires rose and fell by intrigue as much as by battle, such qualities proved as necessary as the sword. The Seleucid throne itself had grown unstable. Rival claimants fought for power, and each sought allies wherever they could be found. Jonathan, once hunted as a rebel, now found envoys approaching him with offers of favor. One king promised titles if he lent support. Another offered weapons in exchange for loyalty. Jonathan, discerning the weakness of their empire, played one against the other. Slowly, he secured recognition not as outlaw but as legitimate leader, even being granted the high priesthood by royal decree. It was a bitter irony, for the office once defiled by bribery was now bestowed by foreign kings. Yet under Jonathan's hand it became a tool to strengthen the nation rather than weaken it. He fortified Jerusalem, rebuilt its walls, and garrisoned its citadel. His rule stretched beyond the city, and for the first time in centuries Judea began to act not as a pawn of empires but as a force of its own. Though he still bore the scars of war, Jonathan's skill lay in securing peace through shrewd alliances, ensuring that Israel survived while larger kingdoms bled each other dry. His reign ended in betrayal, ambushed by treachery at a banquet, but his work left the nation stronger than he had found it. Then Simon, the last of Mattathias's sons, took command. Where Judah had been the warrior and Jonathan the diplomat, Simon was the builder. He understood that victories on the battlefield or in palace chambers meant little unless the people could dwell in safety. He cleared the last Seleucid garrisons from Judean soil and secured independence formerly acknowledged by foreign rulers. Under his leadership, the people tilled their fields without fear, planted vineyards, and rebuilt the villages long scarred by war. Peace, rare and precious, settled upon the land. Simon was declared both high priest and governor. His line granted authority until a prophet should arise again. The nation, weary of endless conflict, embraced him as father and protector. Markets reopened, trade flourished, and the temple once defiled by Antiochus became the beating heart of a free people. Songs once sung of Judah's victories now praised Simon's wisdom, and old men who had lived through exile of spirit marveled to see their children walk with unshackled steps. Thus the revolt that began with Mattathias's fiery defiance and Judah's hammer strokes matured under Jonathan's cunning and Simon's steady hand. Through them, the house of Israel tasted again the sweetness of sovereignty. What foreign kings had scorned as a backwater province was now a nation reborn, standing by the covenant and guided by the blood of men who would not bow. The years of fire and blood at last gave way to a moment that seemed almost like a dream. After generations of foreign rule, Judea stood free, and at its head was Simon, last of the sons of Mattathias. The people, weary of war yet hardened by trial, gathered in solemn assembly to acknowledge him not merely as a commander but as the rightful leader of their nation. They clothed him with authority as high priest, governor, and captain, declaring that his descendants should hold these offices until a prophet arose to speak once more with the voice of God. It was a covenant between people and leader, a bond forged from suffering and sealed with hope. Simon carried none of Judah's fiery reputation, nor Jonathan's intricate schemes, but he bore something the people longed for most: stability. His hand was firm, his heart loyal, his rule marked not by grand gestures but by steady faithfulness. Under his leadership, the land that had trembled with battle cries began to hear the hum of plows and the laughter of children in the streets. Villages once burned were rebuilt, vineyards replanted, and fields restored. The scars of oppression faded as life returned to the soil, and for the first time in centuries, the people of God tasted freedom not in fleeting glimpses but as daily bread. The temple, purified by Judah, now flourished under Simon's care. Sacrifices rose without interruption, festivals were celebrated in their proper season, and the law was honored as the heart of the nation. The priesthood, long corrupted by bribes and politics, seemed renewed under his hand, not because Simon was flawless, but because he remembered whose servant he truly was. The altar that once bore swine's flesh now bore the lambs of covenant faith, and the people came with joy rather than fear. Simon also secured the nation's borders, driving out Seleucid garrisons and establishing fortresses that guarded against sudden assault. Foreign rulers, recognizing the futility of breaking this hardened people, entered into treaties instead of wars. Coins were struck in Judea's own name, a symbol that they were no longer pawns of empires but masters of their own destiny. The sight of such coinage, bearing inscriptions of freedom, stirred pride in the hearts of farmers and merchants alike, tangible proof that the days of humiliation had ended. For all his achievements, Simon remained a man of simple faith. He walked not as conqueror but as steward, holding together a fragile unity, born of struggle. His reign marked the flowering of the Hasmonian dynasty, a season when Israel once again could speak of kingship, though wrapped in priestly robes. Yet beneath the joy lingered a quiet awareness that human rule, however noble, could not replace the voice of heaven. The people had their freedom, their temple, and their leader, but still they waited for something more: the prophet, who had not yet come, the promise that had not yet been fulfilled. Still, for a generation, Simon gave them peace, and peace itself felt like a miracle. The kingdom born in struggle did not remain content within its narrow borders. Under Simon's heirs, the Hasmonians looked beyond the hills of Judea and saw opportunity in the weakness of surrounding nations. What began as defense soon grew into ambition. With every campaign, their reach extended, and the small nation once despised as a backwater province became a force to be reckoned with in the land. John Hyrcanus, Simon's son, proved especially relentless. He inherited both his father's resolve and a taste for conquest. With Seleucid power fractured and distracted, he struck at old enemies who had once mocked Israel's weakness. Cities fell before his armies, and the borders of Judea stretched wider than they had since the days of Solomon. Idumea, home of the descendants of Esau, was subdued, and its people compelled to embrace circumcision and the law. Samaria, long a rival and thorn in Judea's side, was crushed, its proud temple on Mount Gerizim destroyed so that Jerusalem's sanctuary stood alone as the heart of worship. Each victory was hailed as fulfillment of promises long delayed. Farmers whose fathers had cowered under foreign tax collectors now saw their sons return in triumph from battles won. The nation swelled with pride, convinced that God had once more granted dominion to his people. For a generation, it seemed as if the curse of exile had been broken, as though the covenant itself had blossomed anew in the strength of the Hasmonian arms. But conquest carried with it a shadow. The same family that had risen to resist foreign tyranny now began to wield the tools of empire for themselves. Forced conversions and political subjugation replaced the vision of freedom that had stirred Mattathias to strike. Some whispered that the line of priests had taken on the arrogance of kings, cloaking ambition in the garments of the covenant. In villages pressed to accept Judean rule, resentment smoldered, and among the faithful, unease grew at the blurring of zeal for God and hunger for power. The temple continued to stand at the center of national life, yet its priests were also generals and rulers, men balancing incense with swords. The Hasmonians minted coins that bore their names, sat in courts as monarchs, and marched as conquerors, their power echoing the nations they had once resisted. Some rejoiced at this newfound strength, believing Israel had finally reclaimed her rightful place. Others feared that the line between covenant faithfulness and political ambition was already fading. Expansion brought wealth, glory, and security, but it also stirred divisions within. The people who had risen to defend their law now wrestled with what it meant to wield dominion. The hammer that once shattered foreign oppression was being forged into a crown, and the question lingered whether such power could remain pure. For now, the Hasmonians grew strong, their armies triumphant, their borders wide, but beneath the victories lay the seeds of future conflict, sown in the soil of ambition. The freedom won by the sons of Mattathias gave Israel breath, but with peace came new struggles. No longer pressed only by foreign decrees, the people began to wrestle with themselves, and in the crucible of that debate, two streams of thought emerged that would shape the generations to come. Out of the priestly courts rose the Sadducees, wealthy and aristocratic, guardians of the temple and its sacrifices. Out of the study halls and marketplaces grew the Pharisees, teachers of the law who carried its demands into every corner of daily life. The Sadducees found their strength in the temple precincts, in the dignity of ritual and the authority of tradition. They clung to the written Torah, but rejected the developing interpretations that surrounded it. To them, the priesthood was central, the altar unshakable, and the nation's survival tied to the proper performance of sacrifices. They held no hope in resurrection, no expectation beyond the here and now. Their power rested on alliances with rulers and the stability of the present order. As long as the temple stood, so too did their influence. The Pharisees, however, saw the covenant differently. For them, holiness could not be confined to the courts of Jerusalem, but must be lived in kitchens, fields, and workshops. They embraced the oral traditions that explained how to apply the law in every detail of life, from how bread was baked to how tithes were given. They believed in resurrection, in angels and the world to come, and in a God who judged not only nations but individuals. Their authority lay not in temple stones but in the hearts of the common people, who found in their teaching a way to walk with God even far from Jerusalem. At first, these were not enemies but differing voices, yet the tension between them grew. The Sadducees looked down on the Pharisees as innovators who burdened the people with endless rules. The Pharisees accused the Sadducees of pride, of clinging to power and neglecting the deeper demands of justice and mercy. The divide was more than theology, it was class and culture. Temple aristocrats against village teachers, the wealthy against the ordinary. Both, in their own ways, sprang from the soil of the Hasmonian age. The corruption of the priesthood had stirred resentment that blossomed into the Pharisees' insistence on purity of practice. The transformation of priests into rulers had given rise to the Sadducees' dominance. Together they represented the nation's struggle to answer a pressing question. In a world between empires, what did it mean to be faithful to God's covenant? The debate would not end. Over time, their arguments sharpened, their influence deepened, and their rivalry became part of the very fabric of Jewish life. In the silence of prophecy, these sects became the interpreters of God's will, preparing the stage for a future where their disputes would echo even in the presence of one greater than both. The empires of the East had risen and fallen in their turn, Persia's grandeur fading before Alexander's sword, the Seleucids stumbling under their own weight, the Ptolemies reduced to shadows of former glory. Yet as these kingdoms declined, another power stirred far to the west. A republic of disciplined soldiers and relentless ambition. Rome, once a cluster of villages by the Tiber, had already subdued Italy. Then Carthage, then Greece. Step by step its legions pressed eastward, and the Mediterranean began to be called not many seas, but one. Mare Nostrum, our sea. To Judea, the news of Rome came first as rumor carried by merchants and envoys. Tales spread of armies that never broke, of generals who conquered not just with swords but with roads and law. Traders from Alexandria whispered of Roman governors now seated in once proud Greek cities, their authority backed by the weight of legions. At first, Rome seemed a distant storm, its thunder echoing beyond the horizon. But storms roll ever closer, and soon its winds would sweep across the hills of Judea. The Hasmonians, flush with victory and expanding power, could not ignore the shifting balance. Their rivals in the region, Seleucid remnants, petty kings, even the Ptolemies clinging to Egypt, sought Roman favor, offering tribute or treaties in hopes of securing allies against their enemies. To be noticed by Rome was both blessing and danger. Those who aligned themselves gained protection, but the price was often independence itself. In Jerusalem, debates sharpened. Some argued that Rome's discipline and justice might bring stability, that alliances with the Republic could secure Judea's borders against hostile neighbors. Others warned that no nation had embraced Rome without eventually being shackled by it. The people remembered too well what it meant to bend before foreign masters. Yet ambition clouded judgment. Hasmonian rulers, caught in rivalries with neighboring states and even among themselves, began to court Roman attention, sending envoys across the sea to plead their cases before the Senate. Rome, pragmatic and watchful, weighed these appeals not with sentiment but with calculation. To the Republic, Judea was not a chosen nation but a square on the board of empire, a crossroads between Egypt and Syria, a strip of land through which armies and commerce alike must pass. What Rome desired above all was order, and any people who disrupted it would be crushed. Thus the silent years drew nearer to their climax. Prophets no longer thundered, yet the stage was filling with actors whose presence would shape the world into which the Messiah would come. Rome's gaze turned eastward, and once it fell upon Judea, it would never turn away. For the people of the covenant, the question was no longer whether foreign powers would rule, but how they might endure under a dominion unlike any they had faced before, a dominion that would stretch from Britain to Babylon, and in whose shadow the story of redemption would soon unfold. The house that had risen in unity now began to crumble under the weight of its own ambition. The sons of Mattathias had fought shoulder to shoulder against Antiochus, but their descendants, seated on thrones and wearing crowns, turned those shoulders against one another. The Hasmonian dynasty, once born of covenant zeal, was now torn by rival claims to power, each brother or cousin convinced that the mantle of rule belonged to him alone. It began with disputes over the high priesthood, for the office had long since become more than sacred duty. To be high priest now was to wield political power, to control wealth, armies, and alliances. Families divided between supporters of one claimant or another, and the holy city itself became a battlefield. Priests in the temple courts clashed with soldiers in the streets, while elders who once prayed for peace found themselves forced to take sides. As the quarrels deepened, the vision of Israel's freedom dimmed. Fortresses built to repel foreign armies were turned against fellow Jews. Sieges starved neighborhoods not of pagans but of covenant keepers. The songs of victory that had once celebrated deliverance from Antiochus were drowned by the cries of brothers at war with brothers. The Hasmonian dream, born in blood but consecrated in covenant, fractured into bitterness and betrayal. Some factions, desperate to prevail, sought aid from foreign powers. Envoys carried gifts to Damascus, to Alexandria, even to Rome itself, each petitioning outsiders to intervene on their behalf. Thus, the people who had fought so fiercely for independence now invited strangers into their quarrels, opening the door to dominion once more. The covenant people, meant to be a light to the nations, risked becoming a prize to be divided by them. The ordinary folk, caught between rival banners, longed for stability. Farmers could not tend their fields without fear that soldiers would seize their harvest. Merchants watched trade falter as roads became unsafe. Families who had once rejoiced in the temple's rededication now watched with sorrow as its precincts echoed with shouts of faction rather than songs of praise. The sanctuary was no longer the center of unity but the contested prize of power. Through it all, a sense of weariness spread. The giants of the past, Judah the hammer, Jonathan the shrewd, Simon the steady, seemed distant memories, their sacrifice dishonored by heirs who mistook ambition for service. The people began to ask if freedom itself had been squandered, if their struggles had merely replaced one form of tyranny with another. Civil war left scars deeper than those carved by foreign oppressors. The enemy outside had once united Israel. The enemy within tore it apart. And in the midst of the chaos, Rome, watchful and patient, saw its chance. For a fractured people are easily subdued, and a divided house, however strong its walls, cannot stand. The quarrels of the Hasmonian princes had opened the door, and through that door marched Rome. When Pompey, the celebrated general of the Republic, turned his gaze toward Judea, it was not with reverence for a holy nation but with the cold calculation of empire. He came as arbiter between rival claimants to the throne, each of whom had summoned him in desperation, never imagining what it meant to invite the legions into Jerusalem. Pompey arrived with the weight of victories already behind him, conqueror of pirates, subduer of Asia, master of Syria. To him, Judea was but a small stone in the mosaic of empire, valuable only for its place at the crossroads of the world. Yet when he entered the city and saw the Temple Mount, towering and fortified, he recognized that its possession was the key to controlling the people. The gates of Jerusalem did not open willingly. One faction surrendered, hoping Rome would confirm their leader as ruler, but another held fast within the temple itself. For 3 long months, the siege dragged on. Roman engines battered the walls, trenches were dug, towers raised. The defenders, pious and desperate, clung to the sanctuary, convinced that the God who had once felled Assyrians might yet defend his dwelling place. But heaven remained silent, and the relentless discipline of Roman steel ground down their resistance. When at last the Temple Mount was breached, the legions poured in, red shields flashing in the sun. Blood stained the courts where once priests had offered sacrifices of peace. Thousands fell, and the holy city trembled under the weight of foreign boots. Pompey himself strode into the sanctuary, climbing the steps none but the high priest dared ascend, and pushed aside the veil to gaze upon the Holy of Holies. To the astonishment of his soldiers, He found no idol, no statue, no treasure, only emptiness, an unseen God whom Israel worshipped without image. In silence he looked, and in silence he withdrew. But the desecration was done. The temple was spared from plunder. Pompey, perhaps curious or cautious, forbade his men to seize its wealth, but Judea's freedom was gone. Tribute was imposed, fortresses occupied, and the land that had fought so fiercely for independence now bent beneath the Roman yoke. Kings would still be crowned, high priests still anointed, but always at the pleasure of Rome. For the people, the memory of Pompey's intrusion cut deep. The sanctity of the most holy place had been violated, and though no image stood there, the sight of a pagan general within its walls burned like fire in their hearts. The silent years of waiting grew heavier still, for prophecy had not returned, and now the oppressor was unlike any before an empire that seemed eternal, unyielding, and vast. The people longed for deliverance, whispering of promises not yet fulfilled. And in their anguish, the stage was set for the coming of one who would cleanse more than a temple and claim a kingdom not made with hands. The day Pompey marched out of Jerusalem, the city still smoldered with the memory of his soldiers trampling its courts. Though the temple still stood, though sacrifices still rose, something essential had been broken. Judea was no longer a free people, but a province of Rome's making, bound not by covenant alone but by chains of tribute and submission. Independence, hard won by the Maccabees, slipped away like sand through open fingers. Rome did not strip away every outward sign of rule. Kings still sat upon thrones, high priests still wore their garments, coins still bore Hebrew inscriptions, but beneath the surface, all was hollow. The true power lay not in Jerusalem's walls, but in the will of Rome. Every ruler who claimed authority did so at Roman pleasure, confirmed by governors or by the Senate, and every decision had to reckon with the presence of legions stationed nearby. The Hasmonian heirs quarreled still, each willing to bow lower than the last if Rome would grant him the crown. Families once united in revolt now schemed for advantage, bribing Roman officials, sending gifts across the sea, desperate to maintain scraps of authority. Their rivalries only deepened dependence, for Rome thrived on division, rewarding one claimant today and another tomorrow, always ensuring that no Jewish king could stand apart from their shadow. The people felt the change in countless small ways. Taxes grew heavier, demanded not just for the temple but for Caesar. Soldiers walked the streets, their Latin commands harsh against the cadence of Hebrew prayers. Disputes once settled in local courts were now subject to Roman law, and the freedom to govern themselves dwindled with every passing year. The land promised to Abraham seemed once again under foreign heel, and many whispered bitterly that the victories of Judas Maccabee had been in vain. Yet beneath despair, hope smoldered. The prophets had spoken of kingdoms rising and falling, of God's rule enduring when empires crumbled. If Rome seemed eternal, so had Babylon once, so had Persia, so had Greece. The memory of deliverance from Egypt, from exile, from Antiochus, still shaped the heart of the people. They waited, not in silence, but in yearning, for a deliverer greater than the sons of Mattathias, one who would not merely cast off the yoke of a single oppressor but bring an everlasting kingdom. For now, Judea was a client kingdom, free in name but enslaved in truth. Its leaders wore crowns that Rome could strip away at a whim. Its priests prayed in a temple where a pagan general had walked unpunished. Its people carried burdens heavier than their fathers had borne. The last light of independence had been quenched, and the night of Roman dominion stretched long before them. But in that night, the longing for dawn grew sharper, and the hope of Messiah burned brighter than ever before. Amid the ruins of Hasmonian pride rose a figure unlike any who had come before, a man both Jew and foreigner, both king and servant of empire. Herod, later called the Great, was not of the priestly line nor of David's house, but of Idumean blood, descendants of Esau compelled generations earlier to embrace the covenant. He grew up under the shadow of Rome, and from his youth learned that survival came not from purity of faith, but from shrewd calculation, from knowing when to bow and when to strike. Herod's rise was swift and ruthless. Appointed governor of Galilee while still young, he impressed his Roman patrons with a mixture of efficiency and mercilessness, crushing bandits with a cruelty that sent fear rippling through the land. To the Senate in faraway Rome, here was a man useful, loyal to their cause, willing to enforce their will in a restless province. When civil war tore Judea apart, Herod placed his bet not on the fading Hasmonian heirs but on the legions across the sea. He journeyed to Rome, stood in the halls of power, and was crowned by decree not of prophet or priest but of Caesar himself, king of the Jews, though the people had never asked for him. With Roman backing, Herod fought his way to the throne, besieging Jerusalem until it fell into his hands. His path was marked by rivers of blood, for rivals were shown no mercy. Hasmonian princes, once proud rulers, were executed or forced into exile, their line extinguished so no seed of rebellion could sprout. Even his own family was not safe. Suspicion was enough to doom wife, sons, or brother-in-law if Herod feared their loyalty. His reign was secured by terror as much as by law. Yet Herod was more than butcher. He was a builder of dazzling ambition, determined to leave monuments that would awe his subjects and please his Roman masters. Fortresses rose on cliffs and deserts, palaces gleamed with marble. Cities were founded that bore Caesar's name. Most of all, he rebuilt the temple, expanding it into a wonder of the age. Stones larger than any laid by Solomon were fitted together with precision. Courts widened, walls raised. Pilgrims from every corner of the earth marveled at its splendor, and even Rome acknowledged the grandeur of the king's work. But behind the glitter of construction and the pomp of titles lay a man haunted. Herod craved legitimacy he could never possess. The people whispered that he was not truly of Israel, that his throne rested on foreign spears, not covenant promise. He sought the favor of priests, yet appointed and dismissed them at will. He courted Rome, yet feared its displeasure more than he feared heaven. His rule embodied the paradox of Judea's fate, powerful in appearance, fragile at the root, torn between loyalty to God and subservience to empire. Thus Herod reigned, ambitious, ruthless, and Roman-backed, shaping the land into which a child would soon be born, a child whose kingdom would not rise on blood and stone, but on truth and spirit, and whose throne no Caesar could bestow or take away. Herod wore the crown of Judea, but it sat uneasily on his head. Though Rome had declared him king, though armies and fortresses bent to his will, he knew the people never fully accepted him. He was Idumean, descendant of Esau, bound to Israel by forced circumcision generations earlier. In the eyes of many, he was forever a foreigner ruling the covenant nation, a man who could rebuild the temple's stones but never touch its soul. Suspicion clung to him like a shadow. The priests served at his command, but whispers filled their courts that Herod was no son of David, no rightful heir to the promises. The Pharisees, guardians of the law, measured his deeds and found them wanting, refusing to call him more than a puppet of Rome. Even among the common people, gratitude for his building projects could not erase the knowledge that his throne was propped up by legions. He gave them a temple more magnificent than any they had seen, yet they looked past the gold and saw the foreign hand that had placed it there. Herod understood the depth of their mistrust, and he answered it not with humility but with iron. Rivals were hunted down, Hasmonian claimants eliminated, even his own kin struck down when their loyalty was doubted. The high priesthood, once the sacred office of Aaron's line, became his tool, bestowed and withdrawn like a prize in a game. Each execution, each dismissal, each act of violence reminded Judea that Rome's king ruled not by covenant but by fear. Yet Herod was not content with terror alone. He sought to clothe his authority in grandeur, reshaping the land with monuments that could not be ignored. He raised fortresses on mountain tops that seemed to scrape the sky, built cities that bore the mark of Greek design and Roman order, and above all, expanded the Temple Mount into a sanctuary that rivaled the wonders of the world. To stand in its courts was to be overwhelmed by scale and splendor, a house of God that bore Herod's name as much as Solomon's. Still, the unease remained. No walls, however high, could protect him from the knowledge that he was never truly embraced. He tried to bridge worlds, offering sacrifices as a Jew while hosting games in honor of Caesar, speaking the language of his people yet bowing to Roman masters. To the faithful, he was a pretender. To Rome, he was a servant. To himself, he was a king, constantly defending a crown that was never secure. Herod's reign became a study in contradictions, piety mingled with cruelty, devotion with ambition, splendor with paranoia. He ruled as the Idumean king, tolerated, feared, admired, yet never fully loved. And as his grip tightened, the longing in Israel grew stronger. Not for a ruler of Rome's choosing, but for one of God's sending, a true son of the covenant who would reign without suspicion and whose throne no empire could claim. Herod's ambition burned hotter than suspicion, and nowhere did it blaze more brightly than in his greatest project, the rebuilding of the temple. To the people of Judea, the sanctuary on Mount Zion was the dwelling of God's name, the heart of their faith and the sign of their covenant. To Herod, it was also an opportunity, a way to silence doubts about his lineage by adorning Israel's holiest place with a glory unmatched in all the world. If he could not claim David's blood, he would at least clothe the temple in splendor that rivaled Solomon's. The work began in the 18th year of his reign. Herod called together priests trained as builders so that the sacred stones would be laid by hands that knew the law. He expanded the mount itself, raising enormous retaining walls of stones so vast that later ages would wonder how human hands could have moved them. Platform upon platform rose until the temple stood not only as a house of worship, but as a mountain of human craftsmanship, visible for miles across the Judean hills. The sanctuary itself gleamed with white marble, its face catching the sun so that travelers approaching from the desert shielded their eyes against its brilliance. Gates were overlaid with gold and silver, doors so heavy they seemed to defy movement until swung open by teams of men. Courtyards spread wide enough to hold thousands of pilgrims during the feasts, colonnades lined with columns that dwarfed even the tallest man. The courts of the Gentiles stretched vast and open, proclaiming to the nations that Israel's God was not hidden but exalted. Within, the holy places were rebuilt with reverence, patterned after the design given to Moses and Solomon. Golden lampstands burned perpetually. The altar of incense sent sweet smoke rising heavenward, and the great altar of burnt offering dominated the outer court. Yet the Holy of Holies remained as always a chamber empty of image, veiled from sight, a silent reminder that Israel's God could not be contained by stone or ornament. Herod spared no expense. He taxed heavily, he imported rare materials, he employed thousands of laborers. Roman engineers marveled at his skill. Greek architects admired his design, and even enemies admitted that the work was without equal. Pilgrims who came to Jerusalem during the feasts wept at the sight, for the temple seemed at last restored to the glory sung of in the Psalms. But beneath the wonder lay unease. The people knew whose hand had built it, whose name was whispered in the courts alongside God's. The splendor of the sanctuary did not erase the cruelty of the king. Herod's temple was a paradox house of God, adorned by the ambition of a man despised holy place wrapped in the politics of empire. Still, it stood, a marvel of stone and faith, awaiting the day when one greater than Herod would walk its courts and declare that not even such massive stones could endure forever. In the silence left by prophecy, when no new word came from heaven, the people turned to those who could teach them how to live faithfully under foreign yokes. Out of that longing rose the Pharisees, men who believed the covenant was not confined to temple courts or the hands of priests, but could shape the life of every home, every field, every meal. They were not kings, nor priests, nor warriors, but interpreters of the law, guardians of tradition, champions of Torah written and spoken. The Pharisees looked upon the Torah as a living guide, not a relic locked in scrolls. To them, obedience was not simply sacrifice at the altar, but the sanctification of daily life. Washing hands before bread, separating tithes from harvest, guarding Sabbath rest. These were not small rituals, but ways to draw near to the God who had chosen Israel. They believed Moses had received more than written words at Sinai. An oral law accompanied it, passed from generation to generation, expanding and explaining how God's will should be lived in every circumstance. This oral law became their treasure, a well of wisdom deeper than written command alone. The people found in the Pharisees a voice they could trust. The Sadducees clung to temple power and Roman favor. But the Pharisees walked among farmers and artisans, teaching in synagogues scattered across the land. They carried the covenant into the villages and marketplaces, into kitchens and vineyards, showing that holiness was possible even far from Jerusalem. In their teaching, the home became a sanctuary, the table an altar, the family a congregation. Faith was not bound to a place but to a way of life. They were also men of hope. Unlike the Sadducees, who saw little beyond the present age, the Pharisees proclaimed belief in resurrection, in angels, in judgment to come. They taught that righteousness would not perish with death, that justice would find its fulfillment in a world yet unseen. This hope comforted the oppressed, those who looked upon Roman spears and Herod's cruelty and wondered if God had forgotten. The Pharisees answered, "No deed is wasted, no life unnoticed, for God will raise the faithful and set the world right." Yet their zeal for the law could harden into burden. The endless debates, the meticulous rulings, the fences built around the commandments sometimes weighed heavily on those who longed for mercy more than precision. Their authority grew, and with it came pride, the danger of mistaking interpretation for revelation. Still, they endured because they gave the people something no king could grant and no priest could preserve, a way to remain Israel in the midst of exile within their own land. In the long night between Malachi and the Messiah, the Pharisees became keepers of memory and hope. Their voices filled the silence, their teachings shaped a nation's heart, and their influence would echo into the days when a new teacher would stand among them, affirming some of their truths, challenging others, but always recognizing the depth of their devotion to the covenant of God. While the Pharisees carried the covenant into homes and synagogues, another group clung tightly to the Temple Mount and the power it bestowed. These were the Sadducees, the priestly elite, descendants of ancient lines, guardians of ritual sacrifice, and custodians of the sanctuary Herod had adorned. Their strength lay not in numbers but in position. They held the high priesthood, managed the temple treasury, presided over offerings, and stood as mediators between Rome and the people. In their hands, the heart of Israel's worship pulsed, yet it beat in rhythm with politics as much as with devotion. The Sadducees placed their trust in the written Torah alone. They rejected the vast oral traditions cherished by the Pharisees, dismissing them as human invention. To them, the law of Moses was sufficient, its commands bound to the life of the nation as it stood. They denied the resurrection, the hope of a world beyond death, and doubted angels and spirits that others revered. Their faith was this worldly, tied to altar, priesthood, and sacrifice. When the temple flourished, they flourished. When the temple was threatened, so too was their identity. Among the common people, the Sadducees inspired little love. Their wealth set them apart. Their Roman alliances bred resentment, and their disdain for resurrection robbed the poor of comfort. Yet none could ignore their influence. Festivals were shaped by their oversight, sacrifices required their priests, and the high priest, drawn from their number, entered the Holy of Holies each year on the Day of Atonement. Even those who scorned them needed them, for without their service, the covenant rituals could not be fulfilled. Rome found the Sadducees useful. Loyal to order, cautious of rebellion, they worked to preserve the fragile balance that kept the temple standing under imperial watch. Better to compromise, they reasoned, than to provoke destruction. To the Pharisees, this pragmatism looked like betrayal, but to the Sadducees, it was survival, the preservation of the sanctuary at any cost. Still, the cost was great. Their focus on power left them vulnerable to corruption. High priestly offices were sold and traded. Their sanctity diminished. The poor saw little of their compassion, and the common worshipper often felt alienated from their aloofness. They appeared less as shepherds of Israel and more as aristocrats guarding their privileges. Yet even in their faults, they embodied a tension running through the silent years. How to remain faithful when surrounded by empires. They chose preservation through alliance, clinging to the temple as anchor, even if it meant bowing before Caesar. In time, their strategy would fail, and the temple they served would fall in ruins. But in these centuries, their voice shaped Israel's worship, their hands guided the sacrifices, and their denial of resurrection left a stark contrast to the Pharisees' hope. Between heaven and earth, they fixed their gaze only on earth, and in doing so, secured their place as both guardians of the sanctuary and symbols of its fragility. While Pharisees debated in synagogues and Sadducees ruled the temple courts, another path was chosen by those who could no longer abide either. They looked at the corruption of priests, the compromises with Rome, the clamor of cities, and concluded that faith could not survive in such a world. These were the Essenes, a people of withdrawal, who left the marketplaces and the Temple Mount to seek purity in the wilderness. They gathered in secluded settlements, most famously along the shores of the Dead Sea, where barren cliffs and salt waters formed a stark refuge. There they fashioned communities ordered with precision, every act bound to rules of purity, every meal sanctified as though it were sacrifice. They called themselves sons of light, set apart from the darkness they believed had swallowed Jerusalem. To them, the priesthood in the temple was defiled, and only by separation could they remain faithful to the covenant. The Essenes devoted themselves to scripture with unmatched intensity. They copied scrolls by hand, preserving the law, the prophets, and the writings, but also producing their own works, hymns of thanksgiving, commentaries interpreting current events as fulfillments of prophecy, and visions of final judgment. They believed they lived at the edge of history, poised between this corrupt age and the coming reign of God. Their scrolls spoke of cosmic war, of the sons of light clashing with the sons of darkness, of angelic hosts joining faithful men in battle to cleanse the earth. Life among them was strict. New members underwent long trials before being admitted. Possessions were shared, wealth renounced, marriage often set aside for the sake of purity. Ritual washings marked their days, symbols of cleansing not once but continually. For they longed to live as if already in the kingdom to come. They ate in silence, prayed with fervor, and waited for the teacher of righteousness, the figure who would guide them until the day of deliverance. Though they lived apart, their influence reached farther than they imagined. Centuries later, when jars of their hidden scrolls were uncovered in desert caves, the world saw how faithfully they had preserved the scriptures, how deeply they wrestled with God's promises, how passionately they expected His intervention. Their words echoed the longing of a people weary of corruption, yearning for a kingdom not built by Rome or by Herod but by the hand of heaven itself. The Essenes embodied the yearning for holiness through separation. They could not overthrow empires, nor sway temple politics, but they bore witness to another way, the conviction that when the world is too defiled to reform, the faithful must retreat and prepare for God's own act of renewal. In their silence, in their scrolls, in their desert watch, they awaited the dawn, and though they did not live to see it, their hope lit the horizon of those silent centuries, pointing to a Messiah who would bring purity not by retreat, but by entering the world they had fled. In the shadow of Rome's eagles, when taxes drained the land and soldiers patrolled its streets, another response to oppression took root. Where the Pharisees clung to Torah, the Sadducees to the temple, and the Essenes to withdrawal, the Zealots turned to the sword. They were men who believed the covenant demanded not submission but resistance, that Israel's God would honor those who shed blood rather than bow to foreign masters. To them, compromise was betrayal, and patience a cloak for cowardice. The seeds of their movement lay in the memory of the Maccabees. Stories of Judas the Hammer and his brothers still rang in Jewish ears, tales of farmers turned warriors who had cast down oppressors and cleansed the sanctuary. The Zealots carried that legacy like fire in their bones. If their fathers had driven out Seleucid armies, could they not do the same to Rome? If God had once honored revolt, why should he not honor it again? Their defiance was not only loud but fierce. They refused to pay tribute to Caesar, calling it treason to acknowledge any lord but God. Some refused even to speak Rome's name, lest their lips be defiled by submission. In marketplaces they stirred crowds with fiery words. In hidden places they trained with weapons, sharpening blades not for ritual but for rebellion. Among them were the Sicarii, dagger men who struck in secrecy, slipping through festival crowds to pierce collaborators before vanishing into the throng. Terror became their weapon as much as courage. The people admired and feared them. To many, they were heroes, champions who dared to speak aloud what others only whispered, that Israel must be free or perish. To others, they were reckless, courting destruction that would fall not only on soldiers but on mothers, children, and the temple itself. Rome tolerated no defiance, and every dagger raised invited legions in reply. Yet the Zealots cared little for such warnings. Better to die in battle, they declared, than to live enslaved. Their passion was not without faith. They saw themselves as instruments of God's judgment, holy warriors preparing the way for his kingdom. The law was their banner, freedom their cause, martyrdom their crown. To them, the promise of the prophets meant nothing unless fulfilled by action. Waiting was over. The hour had come. Though still small in number, the Zealots embodied the unrest simmering in Judea. Herod's tyranny, Rome's tribute, the corruption of priests, all fed the conviction that violence was the only answer. Their dream was not merely political independence, but a purified nation, free of pagans and traitors, governed by God alone. In their fury, they set the stage for the war to come. Their daggers would one day draw legions. Their cries for freedom would echo in streets soon running with blood. They were the Zealots' nationalist radicals, born of oppression, sustained by memory, and consumed by a vision of freedom so fierce it would not rest until the land was drenched in fire. Amid the clash of empires and the rise of factions, ordinary life in Judea carried on, for a people cannot live only in the shadow of politics. Markets still opened with the dawn, homes still filled with laughter and labor, families still gathered at tables, and festivals still drew the faithful to Jerusalem. Beneath the weight of Roman taxes and the watchful eyes of soldiers, the pulse of Jewish life beat steady, sustained by rhythms older than empire. The marketplace was the heart of the village. Stalls overflowed with figs, olives, and pomegranates, with fish brought fresh from Galilee, with loaves still warm from the oven. Merchants called out prices, children darted between carts, and women bartered with baskets balanced on their heads. Roman coins passed from hand to hand, stamped with Caesar's face, a reminder that even the simplest exchange bore the mark of foreign rule. Yet among the clamor, Hebrew prayers were whispered, blessings offered before bread was broken, and the law remained a quiet boundary even in the bustle. Homes were simple but sacred. Stone walls and flat roofs sheltered families who gathered in courtyards for meals and storytelling. Fathers taught sons the Shema. Mothers guided daughters in the rhythms of household and garden. The Sabbath shaped every week, turning common meals into feasts, common rooms into sanctuaries. Candles flickered, psalms were sung, and for a day the world's burdens fell away. Even under Rome's shadow, the Sabbath declared a truth no empire could erase. Israel's time belonged to God. Family was the foundation. Children were counted as blessing, their cries a sign of hope. Marriages joined households, weaving kinship into stronger cords of survival. Elders carried honor, their wisdom binding generations together. The cycles of birth, circumcision, marriage, and burial gave structure to life, anchoring joy and grief alike in the covenant story. Festivals lifted the ordinary into the extraordinary. Passover brought families streaming to Jerusalem, recounting deliverance from Egypt while eating lamb and unleavened bread. Weeks later, Shavuot marked the giving of Torah, fields offering their first fruits in gratitude. In autumn came booths of branches for Sukkot, when families ate beneath fragile shelters to remember wandering in the wilderness. Pilgrims filled the temple courts with prayers and songs, their voices echoing from marble colonnades and gilded gates. In those moments, despite divisions and doubts, the people remembered they were one nation, chosen and preserved. Life was not easy. Taxes pressed heavily. Roman soldiers sometimes seized what they pleased. Droughts threatened harvests, and fear of unrest never vanished. Yet through these struggles, ordinary faith endured. A mother blessing bread, a father teaching a psalm, a merchant weighing figs with honesty, such acts carried the weight of holiness. In these homes and markets, in the hum of festivals and the quiet of Sabbath rest, Jewish life between Malachi and Matthew was sustained. While kings schemed and armies marched, it was here in family, in worship, in daily bread that the covenant found its truest strength, keeping hope alive for the one who was yet to come. In days when prophecy was silent and foreign banners waved above Jerusalem, the people turned again to the old visions, and none stirred their imagination more than the dreams of Daniel. His words, written in exile centuries earlier, seemed to breathe with fresh urgency under the weight of new oppressors. 4 beasts rising from the sea, kingdoms rising and falling, the Ancient of Days seated in glory, all became more than distant memory. They became mirrors of the present age. In synagogues and homes, the scroll of Daniel was read with trembling. The visions of empires devouring one another, of horns rising with arrogance only to be cut down, seemed to speak directly of Persia, of Greece, of Rome. Each conquering power appeared in Daniel's beasts, each arrogant ruler in the little horn that dared to exalt itself against heaven. When Antiochus desecrated the temple, many whispered that Daniel had foreseen it, that the abomination of desolation had already come. If that prophecy was fulfilled, then surely the promised deliverance was near. Hope began to cling not to priests or kings, but to cosmic intervention. The Son of Man, coming on the clouds, given authority by the Ancient of Days, became a figure of longing. Who was he? A heavenly being, a glorified Israel, the Messiah himself? Debates filled the night, but all agreed the vision promised an end to oppression and a kingdom that no empire could shatter. In the silence of heaven, Daniel's words became prophecy anew. Apocalyptic writings multiplied in his shadow. Dreams and revelations poured forth from those who sought to interpret the times, weaving visions of angels and demons, of hidden calendars, of heavenly books, where history itself was written before unfolding. These texts did not speak of gradual reform, but of cosmic upheaval, of the old world collapsing so a new creation might rise. Ordinary people, weary of taxes, of corrupt priests, of soldiers in their streets, found solace in the certainty that the empires themselves were doomed. The kingdoms of men were but shadows before the blazing light of God's eternal reign. For the Essenes by the Dead Sea, Daniel was a blueprint of battle, sons of light against sons of darkness. For the Pharisees, his resurrection hope gave comfort in graveside prayers. For the common villager, His promise that the saints would inherit the kingdom kept faith alive when Rome's power seemed unbreakable. The dreams of Daniel became more than visions of the past. They were lenses through which the people read their present and anticipated their future. In those silent centuries, when no prophet stood in the streets of Jerusalem, Daniel's voice spoke again. His dreams became the language of hope, his visions the stage upon which generations placed their expectation. And in the longing for beasts to fall and the Son of Man to reign, the people prepared themselves, unknowingly, for the moment when one would come who would call himself by that very name. You are now going to write this chapter. Make it max 500 words long. Among the writings that stirred hearts in the silent years, none carried such mystery as the Book of Enoch. It claimed to unveil what had been hidden since the days before the flood, when the Watchers descended and mingled with the daughters of men. These tales of cosmic rebellion, of angels bound in chains, and of giants striding across the earth, gave voice to a world haunted by questions of evil's origin. If corruption filled the land, was it only because of human weakness, or did darker powers work unseen? Enoch's visions answered with stories that lifted eyes beyond earth to the heavens, where the drama of creation and judgment played out. The book told of a man taken up by God, guided through the layers of heaven by angelic hosts. Enoch beheld chambers of fire and crystal, treasuries of snow and hail waiting for their appointed day, stars walking in ordered paths, and thrones where judgment would fall upon the wicked. The imagery was strange, often terrifying, but it promised that nothing in creation escaped divine notice. Even the rebellious Watchers, once radiant beings, now wept in chains, awaiting the day when their children, the giants, and all they had corrupted would be swept away. For a people crushed under foreign rule, the book's visions offered both explanation and hope. It explained why evil seemed so vast, so entrenched. It was not merely earthly, but cosmic. Yet it also promised that God's justice reached beyond human courts, that angels themselves were not beyond his hand. If he had bound the mighty Watchers, would he not also judge arrogant kings and pagan empires? Communities like the Essenes treasured Enoch's words, copying them carefully, weaving his visions into their own expectation of final war. His journeys through heaven became patterns for their own prayers, their own hopes of entering purity beyond the corruption of the world. His laments over the fallen angels echoed their own despair over defiled priests and compromised leaders. And his assurance that judgment was certain, even if delayed, gave them endurance in the long silence. The Book of Enoch also shaped imagination. Its pictures of heavenly beings, of rivers of fire, of books where every deed is recorded, seeped into the collective memory. It gave language to longings too great for ordinary speech, visions of a cosmos alive with both rebellion and order, awaiting its final reckoning. Though it was never counted among the sacred scrolls for all of Israel, its influence spread wide, preparing minds and hearts to think of heaven as near, of angels as watchful, of history as a struggle between light and darkness. In the centuries when prophecy had ceased, Enoch's voice rose from the past like an echo, declaring that God had not abandoned the world. His visions whispered that unseen realms shaped earthly struggles, that judgment was certain, and that deliverance would come in its appointed time. In those pages of fire and mystery, many found the assurance that silence was not absence, and that heaven still moved toward justice. In the desolate wilderness where cliffs drop into the lifeless waters of the Dead Sea, a small community labored with devotion to preserve what they believed was the true way of Israel. They saw themselves as sons of light, set apart from a world ruled by corruption and compromise. While priests in Jerusalem aligned with Rome and the temple was defiled by politics, these men withdrew to the solitude of Qumran, where they copied and composed writings with patient hands. From their ink and parchment emerged what would later be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, a library of hope, discipline, and warning. The scrolls revealed a community consumed by order. Every detail of life was governed by strict rules: how meals were to be eaten, how disputes resolved, how purity maintained. Members gave up personal wealth, submitting their possessions to the group, believing themselves participants in a covenant renewal that would restore what the temple had lost. They lived as if already standing at the threshold of the last days, preparing for the great war when the forces of light would face the hosts of darkness. Their writings preserved much of the Hebrew scriptures, copied with astonishing care, ensuring that the law and the prophets would endure unbroken through centuries of turmoil. But alongside these sacred texts, they added their own voice. Hymns rose from their caves, songs of thanksgiving for deliverance not yet seen. Commentaries on the prophets interpreted every empire and calamity as a sign that the end was near. Rules and regulations bound their fellowship tightly, as if purity itself were a weapon for the coming battle. Among their most striking works was the War Scroll, a vivid vision of cosmic conflict, angels marching with the faithful, and armies of darkness swept away in judgment. Another text spoke of a teacher of righteousness, a leader they revered as divinely guided, though opposed by a wicked priest who symbolized the corruption in Jerusalem. For them, history was not random but unfolding in patterns foreseen, every event a step toward the day when God's kingdom would dawn. The scrolls also gave voice to longing. Prayers poured out from their pages, not polished or detached, but aching with urgency. They confessed sin, mourned injustice, and pleaded for God to remember his people. They declared that even in a world where Rome reigned and priests grew rich, God was faithful, and his covenant endured among the faithful remnant. Hidden in caves, wrapped in linen, and stored in jars, these writings survived long after the hands that penned them turned to dust. Their survival would one day astonish the world, but in their own time they served as lifelines of identity for a community convinced that silence from heaven was not abandonment. The Dead Sea Scrolls became the voice of those who would not forget, a testimony whispered from the wilderness that God's word was alive, waiting for the day when it would thunder once more in the land. Through the long silence, when prophets no longer thundered in the streets and empires rose like unyielding mountains, the people of Israel clung to hope by shaping visions of the one who was to come. The figure of the Messiah became a vessel for every longing, every ache, every cry for deliverance. Yet what form this anointed one would take remained a question that stirred debate in synagogues, in the courts of the temple, and in the solitude of the wilderness. For some, the Messiah would be a king like David, a warrior who would shatter Rome's yoke, drive out the oppressor, and raise Israel to glory among the nations. They imagined him with sword in hand, enthroned in Jerusalem, ruling with justice and strength. Songs of David and promises of Nathan's covenant fueled this vision, painting the Messiah as a restorer of national pride and independence. Others looked to the priesthood. Corruption in the temple, high offices sold and traded like goods in a market, left many longing for a holy priest who would cleanse the sanctuary and restore true worship. To them, the Messiah would not conquer armies but purify hearts, leading the people back to covenant faithfulness through sacrifice offered without stain. Such hope tied itself to passages of Zechariah and the promise of a priestly figure who would serve in righteousness before God. Still others turned to the prophets and dreamed of a new Moses or Elijah, a teacher and wonder-worker whose voice would carry the authority of heaven. In a time when scribes argued over interpretation, this hope envisioned a prophet who would speak with clarity that pierced confusion, unveiling God's will as in the days when Sinai trembled with fire. To these believers, the Messiah was the voice of God restored, not in hidden scrolls or distant visions, but in living speech that could not be silenced. Yet there were others who dreamed higher still. Reading Daniel, they saw the figure of the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven, given authority and dominion everlasting. This was no mere earthly king but a heavenly one, a ruler whose kingdom could not be toppled by sword or siege. Such expectation carried a sense of mystery, blending human hope with cosmic vision, stirring anticipation of a Messiah who would stand not only against Rome but against every power of darkness itself. These competing visions did not cancel one another but lived side by side, mingling in the prayers of the faithful. At Passover tables and in festival crowds, in desert caves and temple courts, voices whispered and wondered, will he be a king or a priest, a prophet or a heavenly redeemer? Perhaps all at once. In that longing, shaped by centuries of silence and sorrow, the stage was set. When at last a child was born in Bethlehem, every expectation and every dream waited to see what kind of Messiah had finally come. The prophets had once spoken with fire, their words shaking kings and nations, their visions piercing the veil between heaven and earth. But after Malachi, the voice ceased. No Isaiah rose to thunder judgment. No Jeremiah to weep over the city. No Ezekiel to unveil strange visions of glory. For 4 long centuries, the heavens seemed shut, and silence pressed upon the people like a weight that could not be lifted. It was not the silence of peace, but of absence. Every generation asked if God had abandoned his people, if the covenant still held, if the promises whispered through the prophets were fading into myth. The temple still stood, sacrifices still rose in smoke, prayers still ascended at morning and evening, but the divine voice did not break through the ritual. Priests recited, scribes explained, but no prophet cried, "Thus says the Lord." The ache of waiting grew with each passing year, stretching into centuries that felt like exile even within the land. In that silence, longing deepened. The scriptures were read with new urgency. Each line of promise searched for hidden clues. Daniel's beasts and visions were mined for timelines. Isaiah's servant songs recited with hushed hope. Malachi's closing words of Elijah's return repeated like a promise etched in the heart. The absence of prophecy did not quench desire. It sharpened it, like thirst in the desert sharpening the longing for water. Festivals were kept, songs were sung, but always with an edge of yearning. Passover's lambs reminded the people not only of Egypt's deliverance, but of the deliverance still to come. Tabernacles spoke not only of wilderness wandering, but of a world where God's presence might dwell again among his people. Even the Sabbath, with its rest from labor, became a symbol of a greater rest, yet unrealized. Some tried to fill the silence with their own voices. Apocalyptic writers crafted visions of angels and heavenly thrones, attempting to bridge the gap with written prophecy. Communities like Qumran declared themselves the faithful remnant, keeping purity until God would act. Others turned to politics, seeking in alliances and revolts the hand of deliverance. Yet none could break the silence. No voice carried the unmistakable weight of heaven's authority. The ache of those years was more than frustration. It was formation. In waiting, the people learned to hunger, to strain their ears for the faintest whisper of God. They learned that his word could not be commanded or manufactured. That revelation comes not on human schedule, but in divine time. The silence was not empty but expectant, like soil lying fallow, like a womb before the birth. And so they waited. Farmers plowed their fields. Children played in village streets. Priests offered sacrifices. Scribes copied scrolls, all beneath the heavy hush of heaven. Yet even in the silence, faith endured. The promises were not forgotten, and the ache itself became proof of hope. For silence can prepare as surely as speech, and in the stillness of those centuries the world was being readied for a voice unlike any it had yet heard. Rome's shadow stretched across the earth, and Judea lay beneath it. From the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the forests of Gaul to the sands of Egypt, the eagle standard flew, a symbol of might no kingdom could resist. Legions marched in perfect order, their discipline crushing rebellion, their presence a constant reminder that Rome's peace was forged not in gentleness but in iron. Yet within that harsh rule, the world changed, connected as never before. Stone roads cut through mountains and deserts, binding distant provinces into one empire. Merchants carried spices, silks, and stories across lands that had once been fractured by endless borders. Messengers rode swiftly, couriers of empire who could bring word from Rome to Jerusalem in days rather than months. What had once been isolated regions now pulsed with a strange unity, Rome's roads becoming the veins through which trade, ideas, and armies flowed. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was a peace bought at sword's edge. Cities burned before they were rebuilt. Nations bowed before they were welcomed. Yet for those who lived beneath the settled order, there was stability unknown in generations past. Piracy was crushed, banditry reduced, and travel became possible for those bold enough to attempt it. The seas were patrolled, the highways guarded, and under Rome's vast net of control, a farmer in Judea could feel the echo of decisions made in the Senate halls far across the sea. Roman presence was everywhere. Coins stamped with Caesar's image circulated through Jewish markets, sparking debates about loyalty and idolatry. Soldiers patrolled the streets of Jerusalem, their armor gleaming in the sun, their speech harsh to local ears. Governors sat in judgment over disputes, backed by the authority of legions waiting just beyond the city walls. Tribute flowed steadily toward Rome, a constant drain on a land already weary of oppression. Yet even in subjugation, Rome's rule created conditions that would shape history. The roads that carried Roman soldiers would one day carry Jewish teachers and Christian apostles. The order enforced by the legions would open paths for ideas as well as armies. The empire, unknowing, was preparing the stage for a message that would travel its highways, speak in its common tongue, and confront its emperors with a kingdom not built by human hands. For now, however, the people of Judea felt the weight of empire. They lived beneath the grandeur of Rome's architecture, the efficiency of its rule, and the fear of its punishment. They saw in its power both opportunity and oppression, both stability and bondage. Rome ruled the world, and its peace was unquestioned, but it was the peace of silence after conquest, the stillness that follows when swords have spoken. Into that world of order and iron, the people of Israel still whispered prayers for a different kind of peace. One not imposed by empire but promised by God. Across the vast reaches of the Roman world, stretching from Spain's coasts to the deserts of Syria, one language carried the weight of commerce, law, and thought. It was not Latin, the tongue of Rome's officials, but Greek, shaped by centuries since Alexander's conquests. Once the speech of philosophers and poets, it had softened into koine, the common Greek, a language simple enough for trade, supple enough for story, clear enough to carry ideas across cultures. In the busy markets of Alexandria, in the ports of Corinth, in the streets of Jerusalem itself, voices mingled, yet Greek bound them together. For the Jewish people, this shared tongue was both gift and temptation. In Alexandria, Jewish scholars had already translated the Torah into Greek, creating the Septuagint. With this, the words of Moses and the prophets could be heard by those who no longer spoke Hebrew fluently, by children raised among foreigners, and even by curious Gentiles. Suddenly, the God of Israel could be proclaimed in the language of the empire, accessible to soldiers, merchants, and philosophers alike. Yet this gift carried its danger, for once God's word left the sanctuary of Hebrew, it entered a world of rival gods and competing philosophies. In synagogues scattered throughout the Mediterranean, prayers rose in Hebrew, but sermons and discussions often slipped into Greek. A fisherman in Galilee could sell his catch in Aramaic to his neighbor and then turn to a passing Roman trader in Greek. A Jewish artisan in Antioch could bargain with Syrians, Greeks, and Latins alike, all through the same tongue. This common speech shrank the world, drawing distant peoples into closer contact, weaving their stories together. But the spread of Greek was not only practical, it was cultural. The words of Homer and Plato lingered in the very vocabulary, shaping thought and imagination. Concepts of logos, cosmos, and psyche seeped into Jewish and Gentile minds alike, coloring how they understood existence, wisdom, and the soul. Even those who resisted Hellenization could not escape the reach of language, for every borrowed word carried with it the echo of Greek thought. Yet in God's hidden design, the empire's language prepared the way for something greater. When at last new writings would emerge from Judea, letters, gospels, and visions, they would not appear in Latin or Hebrew but in Koine Greek. The stories of Jesus, the teachings of his apostles, the revelation of God's kingdom, all would travel the highways of Rome in the language every merchant and soldier could understand. The same tongue that carried news of Caesar's decrees would carry the news of a greater king. In this way, the spread of Greek became more than history's accident. It was providence shaping the world's stage, ensuring that when silence broke and a new voice was heard in Galilee, its echo could reach every corner of the empire. What began with Alexander's conquests and endured under Rome became the very channel through which eternal words would flow. In the absence of kings and in the silence of prophets, a new rhythm of devotion took shape among the scattered children of Israel. Far from Jerusalem, where the temple still stood in majesty, Jewish communities in foreign lands found themselves longing for a way to remain bound to the covenant. They could not bring sacrifices across seas and deserts, but they could gather. And so the synagogue was born, a house not of smoke and altar, but of prayer, teaching, and memory. No one could point to the exact day the first synagogue opened its doors. Perhaps it began in Babylon, where exiles huddled together to recite the songs of David beside the rivers. Perhaps it took root in Alexandria, where Jews in a Greek-speaking city needed a place apart to keep their identity alive. However it began, by the time Rome ruled the world, synagogues dotted the map wherever Jews had settled. They stood in bustling cities and small villages alike, simple buildings that became sanctuaries of identity and faith. Within their walls, the scriptures were read aloud, often in Hebrew, sometimes translated into the common Greek so all could understand. Scrolls were unrolled with reverence, their words carried into the ears of young and old. There were no sacrifices here, no priests with incense, but there were leaders chosen to guide the prayers, elders to oversee order, and scribes to teach. It was worship without fire but not without fervor, binding the people together when distance and empire threatened to scatter them for good. For many Jews of the diaspora, the synagogue was more familiar than the temple itself. A Jew born in Cyrene or Antioch might live his whole life without ascending to Jerusalem, but every Sabbath he would step through the doors of the synagogue to hear the law read and the prophets declared. Festivals that could not be kept in their fullness far from Zion were still remembered with psalms and readings. In this way, the synagogue became not just a substitute but a school, training hearts to remain faithful no matter where they lived. The synagogue also became a place where strangers could listen. God-fearing Gentiles, weary of idols yet drawn to the faith of Israel, found a doorway into worship by hearing the scriptures read. Though not all embraced circumcision or the full weight of the law, many stood at the edges, listening with awe, carrying fragments of Israel's hope into the wider world. What began as a necessity became a preparation. In every town of the empire, synagogues stood as embers of devotion, preserving the fire of God's word until the day it would burst into flame anew. When at last a teacher would rise in Galilee, it would be in synagogues that he first read, first taught, and first proclaimed the kingdom at hand. The system born in exile became the very stage on which the long silence began to crack, and heaven's word prepared to walk once more among men. Empires had risen and fallen, languages had spread and mingled, kingdoms had warred and faded, but through it all the world was being prepared for a moment unlike any other. Centuries of silence were not wasted years but hidden preparation, a weaving together of roads, cultures, and longings that would converge at the appointed hour. When Paul would later write that Christ came in the fullness of time, he was naming what all history had quietly accomplished. The stage had been set for the entrance of God's Son. Rome ruled the nations with iron, but in doing so, it brought stability unknown in generations past. Roads stretched like veins across the empire, guarded by soldiers and patrolled by officials, allowing travel and communication on a scale never before possible. What Rome built to carry tribute and armies would also carry the message of a kingdom not made with hands. The Pax Romana, though stained with conquest, created an order where news could move quickly, binding distant lands into one connected world. The Greek language, spread long before by Alexander, remained the common tongue of empire. From Alexandria to Antioch, from Corinth to Jerusalem, men and women of different nations could speak and understand one another. Philosophers debated in it, merchants traded in it, and now the scriptures themselves spoke through it. When the gospel would be proclaimed, it would not be hindered by borders of speech, but heard in the shared words of koine, the language of the people. The Jewish people, scattered through every province, carried their faith wherever they went. Synagogues stood in city after city, preserving the scriptures, gathering the faithful, and opening doors for Gentiles curious about Israel's God. In these humble halls, the soil of expectation was fertile, waiting for the seed of good news. Even in their divisions, Pharisees hungering for purity, Sadducees clinging to power, Essenes waiting in the wilderness, Zealots sharpening their blades there pulsed a common hope that God would act, that his anointed would come, that the silence would finally break. At the same time, despair pressed heavy on the people. The prophets' voices seemed like echoes from another age. Priests grew corrupt, kings served foreign masters, and the land felt weighed down beneath Rome's eagle. It was as if every promise stood on tiptoe, straining to see its fulfillment. The ache of waiting had become unbearable, and in that ache hearts were ready for light to dawn. Thus, history reached its hinge. Roads carried the means of travel, language carried the means of speech, synagogues carried the scriptures, and longing carried the readiness of souls. Nothing in the centuries had been wasted. The silence had tilled the soil, the empires had laid the foundation, and the scattered children of Abraham had preserved the hope. Into this world, prepared by conquest, shaped by culture, and pierced by longing, the fullness of time arrived, and heaven readied to send its word made flesh. 4 centuries of silence had weighed on the people like a stone. Generations had come and gone, carrying the ache of prayers unanswered, the longing for a prophet's voice, the waiting for God to draw near again. Then, in the wilderness, a cry shattered the stillness. John, son of Zechariah, clothed in rough camel's hair and eating the food of the desert, lifted his voice along the banks of the Jordan. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. After centuries of waiting, Israel heard once more the unmistakable cadence of prophecy. The silence was breaking. Crowds streamed to him from Jerusalem, Judea, and the villages beyond. His words carried the sharp edge of judgment and the tender pull of hope. He spoke of mountains made low, valleys lifted, and paths made straight. Some thought him Elijah returned, others a new prophet after the likeness of Moses. He baptized in water as a sign of cleansing, urging the people to prepare for the one greater than himself, whose sandals he was unworthy to untie. His cry was not the fulfillment, but the herald. It pointed beyond itself, declaring that the long night was ending and dawn had begun to touch the horizon. And then, in a quiet village of no renown, a cry far smaller, yet infinitely greater, entered the world. Not the cry of a prophet, but of a child, wrapped in cloth, laid in a manger because there was no room in the inn. The word that had once thundered on Sinai, the voice that had spoken through Isaiah and Jeremiah, now took on flesh and breathed in the night air of Bethlehem. Angels filled the skies with song, shepherds ran to see the wonder, and wise men from distant lands began their journey to kneel before the promised king. The silence had not been empty. It had been the long preparation for this moment. Every empire's rise and fall, every road laid, every language spread, every synagogue raised in a foreign land, all had been guiding history to this humble birthplace. John's rough voice in the wilderness was the trumpet blast that woke the people from slumber. But the infant's cry in Bethlehem was heaven's answer to earth's longing. The long centuries between Malachi and Matthew had left the people yearning for God's nearness, and now that yearning was met in ways beyond imagination, not with armies, nor with political deliverance, nor with fleeting prosperity, but with Emmanuel, God with us. The silence yielded not just to words, but to the Word himself. The cry of a newborn child, fragile and human, was at once the most ordinary and most extraordinary sound the world had ever known. It was the sound of promise kept, of light dawning, of heaven come near. The age of silence had ended, and the voice of God now walked among men.